Today we'll be debating the question, is morality subjective? We've got Bubba and Abysmo. Bubba's taking the affirmative and Abysmo's taking the negative. So Bubba's going to be claiming that morality is subjective, and then Abysmo is going to be arguing against that. The format, this is structured, so it's going to be a 5-minute introduction from the affirmative, 5-minute negative introduction. There's going to be a 30-minute cross-examination on both sides, and then a 5-minute closing on each side. In between the cross-examinations and the closings, we'll do audience questions, which should take about 20 to 30 minutes. And so we'll invite people from the audience up to ask questions. In addition, we will have some Q&As on the YouTube probably. I linked both Bubba and Abysmo's YouTubes in the text chat. I need to link mine as well so you can put Q&A questions in there. I forgot to do that. Do your best during this debate to stay on the main topic. The goal of Bubba is to provide good reasons to believe that morality is subjective, and then the goal of Abysmo is going to be the reverse, so to provide good reasons not to believe that morality is subjective. There will be no over-talking during the introductions and closing statements at all, so let the other person talk during those points. During the cross-examination, either debater can take back their time if they feel like it's going off into the weeds or whatever. That's your time to manage the discussion. If they have a question, if the opponent has a question they want to ask during that, or bring up something they want to bring up from that, use your cross-examination time to do that. The person running the cross-examination is in charge of that 30 minutes. With that being said, the person that is in charge of the cross-examination during their time is the one asking questions. Don't ask questions that aren't pertinent to the discussion during the cross-examination, because there's no need to do that. You can do that during your time. So write down a question or something, unless it's like clarification, or if you decide to have a little bit of back and forth, that's your time as well. Feel free to do that if you're running your cross-examination time. You have 30 minutes during that. With that, keep over-talking in the cross-examination to a minimum. You can over-talk a little bit. Obviously, that happens during discussion sometimes. Just be cognizant of your opponent's time. Also, if you have to interject, please do it in a polite fashion. So if you feel like they're misrepresenting your position, what you said, something like that, just say, hey, I'm sorry to say this, but I feel like you're misrepresenting my position. Just be polite about it, right? Don't try to jump in and just take over their time. No one's enemies here. We're trying to have a fun debate. Please allow your interlocutor to make their points. With that, if you do have to interject, just say, may I interrupt? Do you mind if I jump in? Something like that, right? If interruptions or over-talking are constant, moderation abilities may be utilized to protect either the affirmative or the negative's time. I'm going to do my best to be an unbiased moderator during this debate. Do either of you have any questions before we get started here?
Nope, good to go.
Cool. All right. I linked both of y'all's YouTubes in the YouTube description, but can y'all tell the audience a little bit about each of you, and then we'll go ahead and get started?
Yep, I'll go first. Thanks everyone who I invited that's in the audience right now. You guys know me. My YouTube is linked in Taco's description, and I'll link Taco's YouTube in my description. I believe that Abysmo will be a decent judge of, a decent representative of the Catholic belief when it comes to objective morality. And with that, I'm good to go.
Hi, everyone. This is Abysmo. I am actually not specifically here to defend like a quote-unquote Catholic position on moral objectivity, but I'd like to appreciate you guys anyways for being here, an opportunity to plug. I'm one of the mods of the Ask the Catholics Discord. Would love to see some of you if this debate interests you. If you find out that this debate is interesting in any way, then I invite you also to join us on the Politics Discord and also my YouTube channel, Unscripted Catholic Debates. If you come to the YouTube channel, you'll learn about all things, or about many things, but not just limited to antediluvian Nephilim mysteries, the Dagon fish god, the occult, the cult of the Holy Papaya, the miracle of the Holy Fire, Balaam's donkey, God in ancient China, the Synod on Synodality, Are Souls Annihilated in Hell, the Jesuits, cosmological theories, astrology, the history of psychoanalysis, atheism, and also finally, can the Pope be a formal heretic?
Perfect. And like he said, everybody join Politics Discord from the various audiences. Politics Discord is amazing. So let's go ahead and get started. The affirmative is going to begin. That's Bubba. You've got 5 minutes for your introduction. Excuse me. Give me just one moment, and I'm going to start the timer. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll start it.
All right, yeah, sure. So go ahead. I'm taking the position that I've taken since the day that I deconverted from Christianity, and it's that morality, of course, is subjective. Morality should be defined as the intuitive system as what is good, bad, right, and wrong. And in other words, all things would be amoral because they are determined to be good, bad, right, or wrong by the agent which prescribes it. So I'm going to go ahead and start my opening by biting the bullet that all people that are arguing from a subjective moralist worldview ought to bite down on when debating this topic. And it's the line of reasoning that Abysmo has tried to use against me in the past, and he used it even a few days ago to kind of claim the moral high ground of his view. And it's that to a subjectivist, of course, there is no objective moral truth. So that would mean that feeding the homeless, complimenting people, and helping your neighbor are not objectively good things. They are, generally speaking, what we consider to be like feeding the homeless and all these things, generally speaking, are what we consider to be good, but they are not external to the human mind. They are, like I said, rational conclusions which you draw, which are dependent of your experience of feeding the homeless and complimenting your neighbor. Although it's a comfortable feeling, I would agree, to say that these are objective goods in the world, that feeding the homeless and whatnot, that does not mean that it is true. Just because something, I'll say that again in bright flashing lights, right? Just because something is a comfortable feeling, that does not mean that it is true. Another topic that Abysmo might try to say that is that a subjective moralist is not allowed or has no basis or no reasoning behind telling another person on the way that they ought to behave. And for example, Abysmo, it's not a point that you can use against either a objective moralist or a subjective moralist. The thing that gives you the availability or the right to accuse another person of immoral behavior is because you have to have some type of moral basis to stand on in order to prescribe an ought to what you believe is moral. So to Abysmo, that moral basis comes from God, and to me, that moral basis comes from myself. So if Abysmo makes any attempt of doing either of those two things, trying to claim the moral high ground with saying that these things are not technically objectively true, or tries to say that I have no basis in which I ought to accuse a person of immorality, then I'm going to reply by telling him to answer his own question with what I have just said just here to make sure that he was listening. And when it comes my turn to cross-examine him, which I am going first, about what he believes about what is morality being objective, then I'm going to first establish some very real softball questions about where his basis of morality comes from. Does Abysmo believe that objective moral law because he believes that God exists, or can he explain why morality exists without invoking God? I'd find that very interesting if he could do that, which is one of many questions that I do have prepared. And every argument that I have heard to my objections when I've brought them up to people is either falls into the category of being unfalsifiable by invoking God or disprovable at worst. But what my line of questioning is going to establish first is where and why Abysmo gets his morality from, and then I'm going to show why his line of reasoning might be inconsistent with reality. My questions are very direct, and they're mostly yes or no, but there's plenty of room for like interpretation, more or less. Like we'll get into plenty of discussions. Something that is going to be worth pointing out is that something I'm not going to really tolerate when it's my turn to cross-examine is that Abysmo is infamous for using false terminology in order to seem intellectually superior. And he has a horrible habit, in my experience with him, of not answering simple questions. So, just so the audience on YouTube and on Discord knows that every time he does either of those things, I'm going to speak up. I might abruptly stop him and pull him back on topic. It doesn't mean that I'm not just getting mad, just so people understand. I'm going to simply just call him out. And that's the end of my conclusion. I think I have like 20 seconds left, so 30 seconds, and I can concede the rest of my time.
All right. And Abysmo, whenever you're ready, let me know and I'll start the timer.
Just one moment.
Sure. And let's do our best during this debate to avoid ad hom attacks moving forwards.
Oh yeah, my apologies for that.
Not a big deal. Just let's try to respect each other.
Yep, wasn't my intention.
No worries.
Well, I've shared my screen because I have some visual aids because I try to polish my opening as much as I could, try to fit everything in, but I know I'm going to be running through a lot of stuff, so I thought some visual guides might actually help as we go through it. Because I think this topic in general is extremely broad, right? This is like, is morality subjective? This is a huge ass topic. So it can get pretty tedious, like the topic itself. So if you don't mind, please, check the
The screen is black.
So you can have the visual. Yeah. That's because the slide is black.
Oh, perfect. You're good to go. I started the timer.
All right. Okay. Ready, go. I believe that Bubba is vastly unaware of the moral landscape, and therefore he overstates his understanding of morality, whether subjective or non-subjective. I believe that under scrutiny, Bubba's supposed moral subjectivism will be shown to be either morally real or in fact normative, and therefore fundamentally an appeal to objective moral facts about the world. There's not just one but many arguments for moral realism. To remain doubtful that moral objectivity exists simply because one finds moral intuitions to be questionable does not disprove that objective moral facts exist. To presume that moral subjectivity is morally correct simply because one merely has questions does not constitute an argument or justification that moral subjectivity is sound or even more plausible. Instead, Bubba chooses to do a rather peculiar, dare I say, odd thing, in that he chooses to define both moral subjectivity and moral objectivity, as he understands them to be, as both equally contingent upon a particular subject's intuitive system. He presumes that so long as it is claimed by some moral realists that some moral facts are accessible by an intuitive sense, the same could be supposed for moral subjectivity. But this is a gross miscalculation on Bubba's part. In respect of what I believe are normative duties which are entailed in having a debate in the first place, and in the interest of being intellectually honest about my own perspectives, I'd like to provide a definition of the concept of moral reason for the audience. To be transparent, I am not providing a definition for the following argument from myself, but one that has been provided by Benjamin Blake Watkins. The concept of moral reason can be defined as follows. Some fact or consideration gives us reason for doing action X when this fact or consideration counts in favor of doing action X. This is to say that reasons are given by the facts themselves. For example, the fact that medicine would give me many more years of a happy life gives me reason to take it. This leads us to a deeper question, which is, how does one think about the relationship between truth and reason? Does anything really matter in the sense that we all have reasons to care about some things for their own sake? The concept of moral reason itself is precisely what delivers to us the question of whether there are objective normative truths. I believe the presumption against all forms of normative anti-realism is strong. Therefore, the argument for any form of it would have to be substantially powerful enough to move someone to adopt it. If I were to steelman Bubba's position, it would go something like this. A, if there are any objective normative truths, then there are intrinsic features or properties of something that could give us reasons to care about them for their own sake. B, nothing could give us reasons to care about anything for its own sake. Therefore, C, there are no objective normative truths. If we accept this conclusion, we could further infer, D, we have no reason to prefer a life filled with many happy experiences to a life of unrelenting agony, and E, the fact that some argument is valid and has true premises gives us no reason to accept this argument's conclusion. I believe that these implications to any normal person would be considered hard to believe. Therefore, I offer this counter-argument. F, we have more reason to prefer a life filled with happy experiences than a life with unrelenting agony. G, the fact that some arguments is valid and has true premises does give us decisive reason to accept this argument's conclusion. Therefore, H, there are some objective normative truths. If H is valid, then we can further infer I, some things have intrinsic features or properties which gives us strong reasons to care about them for their own sake. Each argument is symmetrical because each argument takes its premises from the denial of the other's conclusion. The better argument would be the one with the stronger supporting premises. Both arguments, as you can see, are valid in supporting their conclusion. But which argument seems more plausible, F and G, or do we accept B? F and G seem obviously more plausible. It seems unreasonable to ask or for someone to reject the latter propositions F and G on the basis of the former reasons B without some really convincing arguments. What is needed from the normative anti-realist is some argument or set of arguments whose conclusions are B, nothing could give us reasons to care about anything for its own sake, but whose premises are stronger than F and G. The realist argument is clearest and most forceful when using these non-moral normative judgments, but are not limited to just them. The propositions F and G can be strengthened by appealing to moral claims which appear to be self-evidently true upon rational reflection. The realist argument is a challenge to the moral relativists to overcome this implausible implication of their view. The strongest challenge to normative anti-realism is in the form of a question. Why can't the intrinsic nature of something like the importance of evidence or living a full and happy life give us strong reason to care about these things for their own sake? I don't believe normative anti-realists have any good replies to these questions. I argue that anti-realists accept the concept of moral reason because it respects the face value or intuitive nature of our moral practice and words. But if the concept of moral reason is accepted on these grounds, then why reject moral realism? In other words, Bubba seems to have no justification for why he favors the concept of moral reason or moral reason rather than moral realism. Could it just be the case that there are so many problems with moral subjectivism that Bubba's account seems nothing more than a huge error?
And that's time.
What's up, Taco? I'm waiting for you to give me the go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just getting the next timer ready. So we'll go ahead and move into the next section, which is going to be the cross-examinations. Bubba's going to go first on the cross-examination. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll start the timer now.
Okay, I'm ready right now. So I'm going to ask Abysmo. Yep. So, Abysmo, the question that I asked you in the opening, these are real softball questions that I have to start for you is, of course, is morality objective, you would say?
Yes, I do believe morality is objective.
And objective morality is an objective truth, not objective morality, but an objective truth is a truth that is external to the human mind, unchanging, correct?
More or less, I'd say, but it requires some modifications. The way I would put it is that they're stance-independent moral facts.
This isn't moral facts, just like an objective truth. An objective fact is external and is also unchanging.
Well, I can believe in moral objectivity without believing in moral universalism. Are you familiar with the difference?
Yeah, it's like so I'll answer your questions when it's your turn to cross-examine. But,
okay, yeah, it's not that I believe what is objectively moral is some generalized principle that applies to everybody. That's not what I believe.
Yep, that's not what I'm asking you. Okay. That's not what I'm asking you. I just want you to answer an objective truth would be an unchanging truth, which is external to the human mind. The Earth revolves around the sun. That Precisely. And that's unchanging. And
but that's not
true
normative,
regardless of the human mind.
Yeah, but that wouldn't be a normative claim. Right. That could be an epistemic one.
Yep, that's not my question. But my next question is: do you agree with my definition of morality, which is the system which determines good, bad, right, and wrong?
The system?
Yep, the system. Which
I don't.
The internal system which determines good, bad, right, and wrong. No. All right. So we'll just. I do have a time where I will ask you a proper definition for morality then, but
interesting. Okay.
Yep, that is later, right? Because I anticipated that you would disagree. But so objective morality would imply that there is a moral set which is true external to the human mind. That's just conflating both definitions.
Yes.
And so in other words, murder is bad, and it has always been bad, and it always will be bad.
No, that's universalism.
It's external to the human mind and unchanging.
But you're appealing, right? But you're going from the facts about what we observe, in the case of a killing, and you're universalizing it as a general principle.
Let's try to mitigate the usage of those two terms, by the way.
Oh, the M word, which means kill.
Yeah, both of those.
I'm sorry. Okay.
YouTube doesn't like them very much. Sorry, didn't mean to take your time. I'll give you like 10 extra seconds.
I'll do my best. So, and you believe that God is what prescribed us with a set of moral laws, correct?
Not all of them, no.
Not all of them, but we have. Not all of them. That's interesting. We can get to that actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's really gonna depend on where one actually gets like objective moral facts.
It depends on. I say there's. If you're going to say
arguably
that...
Arguably the same could be maintained for access to a quote-unquote Christian God versus a Hindu God versus, a Jewish God. They're going to depend on specific, moral facts, right? Like, do you have access to the scriptures? Do you have access to the Bible? Do you have access to someone actually telling you these things?
Yeah, that's something that I will easily get into you on the last conclusion questions that I have prepared. But an important question, which is the one that I said in the beginning, which I'm very interested to hear your response, is... what I said in the beginning. Can you determine moral truths without a moral law and an ultimate moral lawgiver which prescribes them to me?
Yes, we can.
You
And
can.
that's what St.
How?
Thomas argues. Yes, absolutely.
How?
Through the natural light of our reason, through observation. We could have a
So-
quote unquote. We
Go
could
ahead.
have a like sphere of morality, that we can use to like buttress like further, conclusions about, what we perceive as moral facts, given a set of circumstances.
So you're saying that a person can reason their way to determine what is good, bad, right, and wrong,
Yes.
or moral.
Yep.
Well, congratulations, you're a subjective moralist.
I mean, I would refute that. Again, I mean, I laid out in my opening, right, that I believe that you're actually a moral realist. You're assuming the premise, right, that morality is dependent on some intuitive moral system, right?
Yeah, an intuitive moral system,
Saying
meaning
that
a
that
moral system which
system
requires
is
very little
stands
rationale.
independent. Right, but by the very fact that an external moral intuitive system stands independent means that you believe in objective facts about the world.
And
So you're a moral objectivist. You're a realist.
It's like, Abysmo, you just agreed with me that you can rationalize your way to reasoning what is good, bad, right, wrong, or what is moral through your own interpretation of it, which is the
Reason
definition
and
of subjective.
observations. Yeah, I think you're kind of like, picking and choosing, what you're
Not even.
up from
I'm
what
using
I'm
your
actually
own.
saying.
I'm using your own words, and I'm just providing the logical conclusion as to what it is entailed by. Which is, if you're going to say that I can rationalize through my own experience as to what is moral, that is the definition of subjective.
That is not the definition of moral subjectivity.
Dependent on the human mind, which is also changeable.
Yeah, but it's not. That's not the classical definition.
That if so
I
objective.
think-
You agreed with
I
me
mean,
a second ago.
I find it ironic that you're going to accuse me of using words in like some idiosyncratic way, but that's kind of what that's what
Like
I'm
that.
kind of accusing you
It's
of.
it's not even a little. By the way, your live stream's still on. Second, but you agree with my definition when I said objective. Something that is an objective truth would be something that is external to the human mind and unchanging.
Mhm.
And you just said that you can determine moral truths dependent on the human mind, and they would have the ability to change. I can change my views on morality, correct?
Right. That's why in my opening statement, I was very clear and transparent of what my definition of a concept of a moral reason is, right? That some factor consideration could give us reason for doing a particular action when this factor consideration counts in favor of doing action X. What I'm arguing here is that this is like literally the same starting point for a moral relativist.
Yeah.
The problem, the challenge I was asking you in my opening was that if that's the case,
we
right,
can get
then
into the
why
challenge.
would you?
Abysmo, we can
why
get to the
would
challenge
you-
of your opening later. It's like you can cross-examine me with your opening
Sure.
when it's your turn.
Sure.
I'll back to my line of questioning. Softball questions. You're a Catholic, right?
I don't know, but that seems like a non sequitur to the discussion
it's a
about
simple-
moral objectivity.
Okay, the answer is yes. You believe that you believe in the God of the Bible, correct?
Sure.
And you believe the God of the Bible is omnibenevolent, correct?
I think we can know by his effects that he could have like an omnibenevolent attribute, but I don't believe there's any division or multiplicity of parts within God.
It's one of the essences, one of the natures of God is
one
that he
of
is
the ways that-
omnibenevolent.
Yeah, but the way that we know that, we could be generous or altruistic is through a contingent means of knowledge, right? Like I can know
I don't
based
care about
on
contingent.
time.
I don't care about contingent means of knowledge.
Succession of events, human interaction,
Abysmo, I need to stop you.
observation.
I'm going to pull you back on track,
being
Abysmo.
generous could
Abysmo,
be good.
Abysmo,
And then
you're
I
trying to
will
steamroll me.
apply that
Hey,
attribute to God.
Abysmo, this is Bubba's time. He's requesting his time back.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm pulling you back on topic. The question is simply, is God omnibenevolent? I don't need to know about the way that you contingently express truth.
We can express through human language that he is omnibenevolent, but again,
Okay,
there's
that's
no
all I need.
division of parts, within God.
Yes, that's fine. I'm not claiming that there's division of parts within God. That's completely irrelevant.
Yeah,
You
well,
believe-
I'm going to appeal to Taco now. Taco, can we? I feel like we're a little bit like we're way off topic at this point because the topic is
we're
about
getting-
moral subjectivity.
These questions are going to lead onto the topic, which is about what you determine to be
I
good,
think
bad,
you're
right, and wrong,
begging
and
the
where it comes
question.
from.
I think
I'm
you're
not
begging
even a
the
little
question.
bit. You can tell me I'm begging the question when it's your time, but you believe that everything that God does and commands in the Bible is good, ultimately, correct?
We can discover them to be good for us. Yes.
Discover them to being good. With that,
Yeah.
All right. And would you say that the Bible is a reliable way to interpret God's moral law?
I think scripture is one source that could provide us, not just the scripture, but obviously through an ecclesiastical authority as well for Catholics. Those could be two sources of objective moral facts that, yes,
sure.
that can inform our reason in daily practical living or life. But as far as is the Bible descriptive claims about what the law of God is, that's not only debatable, but then now we're talking about theology and not moral philosophy.
There's the way that you ought to behave,
which is why I'm
the
saying
Bible,
you're begging the question.
The way that you ought to behave morally is in the Bible.
Morality doesn't have to do with descriptive claims. It has to do with normative claims.
Let's mitigate the over talking a little bit as well.
Here, next question is, I just want to see if you're honest. If you barely said that God is omnibenevolent, and that so everything that he does and commands is a way that should be seen as a way that we ought to behave, correct? If God commands us to do something, then we ought to do it.
Yeah, but we only have descriptions of those commands. We don't have
that's fine.
An actual normative claim to it.
If God says if God says jump, then it is good for me to jump.
That's a hypothetical, it's a non sequitur.
It's here a real example.
If he doesn't descriptively tell me to jump in the Bible or through what I consider to be the ecclesiastical authority. They don't tell me to jump.
Here is not a hypothetical. When God commands Moses to go and give the 10 Commandments to the Israelites, that is an objectively good thing to do, correct?
For Moses at that time, if that account is historically reliable, and we could plausibly assume so based on our quote-unquote meta-analysis of the account itself. You're assuming a lot of things, right? Even in the interpretation.
Abysmo, I don't care. Right? I don't care if I'm assuming things. I'm asking you questions. Okay.
Well, you should, because what you're doing is an external critique, right?
Not even. I'm directly going to be calling out the morality of the Bible in a second.
I think you're begging the question.
I knew that you weren't going to answer my questions. I knew that you were going to dance around these topics.
Whether or not morality can be objective without God. I think you're begging that question, Bubba.
So please do engage with his line of questioning, as this is the cross-examination portion. You'll have time to make all these points later.
Well, I mean, those are my responses. I don't know what else to say.
Okay.
It's just what we've established so far. This is my next line of questions is going to lead to. So far, we know that Abysmo believes that there is an objective true moral law, which more or less most of it is prescribed by God, or some of it is prescribed by God, apparently.
I think you're misrepresenting my
everything.
Position.
I'm not. Abysmo, don't interrupt.
Let's stop interrupting.
Yeah, it's in everything that God does and everything that God commands ought to be seen as good, depending on the context, I suppose. This isn't a question, and it's everything that God does and everything that God commands. Humans ought to do so, which leads to my next set of questions. So, Abysmo, just go ahead and briefly, because I was worried that I was gonna end up not filling the 30 minutes. I think that you've done it very well. Go ahead and just quickly, do you follow, as a Catholic or as a Christian, the laws of Moses in the Old Testament or the laws of Jesus in the New Testament?
Are you talking about the Noahide laws specifically?
Yeah,
no, we do not.
No, and so how about the laws that Jesus commands?
I mean, Jesus didn't really prescribe specific, again, descriptive laws or anything, but he did make normative claims.
Yeah, he did. He made two great commandments.
Teachings.
Two great commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and also love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's a way that you ought to behave.
Yeah, those are normative claims. They're not descriptive claims. They're not laws, right? They're not prescriptions. Okay,
I'm not saying that they are. I'm just saying that you ought to follow these laws.
That's kind of you're begging the question of whether it is or not.
I'm not. So I'm not begging any. I can't beg a question when I'm asking a question.
To an ought, Bubba. That's what you're doing.
Here,
you're saying that it is a descriptively a certain way. Therefore, it ought to be, or a quote unquote a Catholic or a Christian ought to, abide it in a particular way.
I'm not saying that you,
critique.
Abysmo. I am not Abysmo. Shush your mouth. I am not claiming that you ought to behave this way. I'm saying Jesus tells you that you ought to behave this way, correct? And you want to go ahead and say that I'm begging the question and all this garbage.
Right, which is a normative claim that I accept.
Okay, and so for the 10 Commandments, for example,
Abysmo, for how I determine objective
Okay, I don't care.
facts or values.
Abysmo, next question. Take the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, for example. Would you say that you ought to follow them? Don't murder,
Yes,
don't lie.
we accept those. We
Okay.
accept those, yes.
So let's make sure that you're consistent and honest. With your worldview, under a particular set of circumstances, is it okay to own slaves?
What does that have to do with the what does that have to do with the Ten Commandments themselves?
It's
Because
the
again,
law
I've
of-
rejected all the Noahide laws, so the Levitical
Because
laws
what-
or the rules in Deuteronomy don't apply to a Christian.
what I'm saying is, if God commands you under a very particular set of circumstances, which He has, to own slaves under a particular people under a particular way, you would do so, correct? Under your
Well,
worldview.
Basically, from the account in Deuteronomy, according to the author, quote unquote, God allows them, right, to trade and hold slaves, right, in a particular way, right?
Yeah.
But we would still have to take the text as a particular quote unquote source of moral facts and not universal.
Yeah,
right?
I don't care
So
your
it's
view
not a-
on said moral
It's not
facts.
right. Well, I'm trying to answer your question. It's not a universal descriptive or prescriptive claim.
I'm
You
not
get what I
claiming
mean?
that they are,
So
Abysmo.
it's not. Well, yeah, you are. You're saying that if
I am not. I have
one
not claimed
accepts,
either
you're
or.
moving from an is to an ought, Bubba. You're saying that if one accepts the Ten Commandments, then one has to accept every single quote unquote divine command theory as it appears in the Old Testament.
Okay, what
We
we've
can only go off the basis that whoever
Sure.
wrote that text
Abysmo, next
heard
question.
God in a particular way for a particular time and for a particular circumstance.
Abysmo,
right?
he's moving on to the next question.
Yeah, next question. I was worried that I wasn't going to get to all my questions. I was going to get to all my questions too fast, but you've shown to me that it turns out I'm not gonna.
We only have the moral fact that it was, in account of that time, right? Again, you're making another epistemological error.
Did the author who wrote Deuteronomy, which is probably Joshua, by the way, did the person who wrote Deuteronomy claim that God commanded them to commit genocide?
He didn't claim. He just said that God told them to do it. That's a descriptive claim. That's not a normative claim. That's what I'm saying.
He didn't claim. He just said God told him to.
No, you're trying to move from a descriptive claim to a normative one, dude. It's another.
I'm not moving towards anything. I'm just asking you questions. But also I was going to bring up more examples, but I think I've made my point with genocide. But the thing is, I assumed that you would agree, but I guess I was wrong to make an assumption that if God commands something, then I ought to do it, because I thought that you would believe that everything that God commands would be a good thing to do. But apparently, I was wrong.
Divine command theory is an objective, moral, I guess, like theory, but that's not the one I ascribe to. That's not one I ascribe to or even consider.
Sure.
There's many reasons to be suspicious of divine command theory because God doesn't directly talk to human beings. He does it through quote unquote people or even his creation.
Here, Abysmo, next question is that, for example, can you recall for the chat, for everyone listening, what happened to Lot's wife?
Please remind me. What's your account?
She was turned into a pillar of salt.
For turning back, right?
Yep, for turning around and looking back on Sodom and Gomorrah.
That's the account, but how do we know that was caused by God?
Do you not think that happened in the Bible?
I mean, are you taking the Bible literally?
I'm asking you a question. Do not answer my question with a question.
But that's what I'm saying. You're presuming a lot of things about what kind of epistemological presuppositions we can have in interpreting the Bible itself, which that's part of the problem of biblical fundamentalism.
Abysmo,
right?
Yes or no? Did Lot's wife become a pillar of salt?
But we know based on how we're able to source
asking you a direct
itself,
question.
like what are more plausible assumptions we could actually read in the text. It might not be as possible that these are literal accounts.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's stop the bulldozing. He's trying to ask you a direct question. Please engage.
Yes or no? Did Lot's wife become a pillar of salt?
According to the account, yes.
And was it because she turned around and looked back on Sodom and Gomorrah?
Oh, I mean, that's debatable. We don't know. I mean, different rabbis have different theories.
Okay, good for them. I'm asking you.
I have no idea because I wasn't there.
Okay, so
and I have no more plausible reason to take it literally rather than allegorically or metaphorically. I don't.
The next question that I was going to lead to is, so what we've established is that what I hoped that we were going to establish, but I guess not, is that Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt because she looked back on Sodom and Gomorrah. She disobeyed God one simple time, and she became a pillar of salt because of it. And then I wanted to point out
Yeah,
a
but
person, a
what
character.
does this
Abysmo,
have to
let me.
do
I have
with
not
whether
asked
or
you a
not
question.
morality is subjective or not?
I was gonna get to it, but I was gonna show what your worldview is entailing. Is that you listen to that if a commandment from God is good,
I was very clear
then
with what my definition of moral reason is.
you were not.
Right
You
at the
danced around
start.
it. But
My
what
opening
was established,
statement. That's why I prepared the slides.
what I
Would
wanted
you
to
like
look
me
at
to
with
go
you,
over it again?
Abysmo,
Just
shut your
so,
mouth.
I'm sure that you're
Hey,
hearing me
Abysmo,
clearly.
let's stop bulldozing, please.
It's like
Taco, it seems I'm not bulldozing.
At this point, should I get like an extra 10 minutes because it's all he's been doing?
I mean, am I not allowed to like
Okay,
respond
let's stop
or
with
call him out
Well,
on?
respond directly to his points. You can do that in
Okay.
your cross-examination.
I wanted to ask Abysmo directly. Why did Pharaoh, you know who Pharaoh is, right?
Which pharaoh?
Exodus.
That's a good question. Which pharaoh was it?
So when Moses left Egypt and then came back, that Pharaoh.
Do you know when Moses went to and from Egypt?
That's a
When was
good
that? When did
question
that
for the
happen, by the way?
cross-examination.
Yeah, that's a great question for when it's your turn to ask me questions.
Well, I'm asking him to clarify what he means
you can
by
ask me when it's your
at
turn to
what
ask
time
questions.
did he do this?
Dude, shut your mouth. I am asking you questions. You can ask me questions when it's your turn to ask questions. I want to ask you why Pharaoh, who is described to have a hardened heart, that Pharaoh, which basically means that he had ultimate stubbornness against God's word, God immediately turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt for disobeying him once, for one simple little thing. But God didn't kill Pharaoh, did not give him the same judgment who not only disobeyed God's word, but ultimately he had ultimate ignorance to God's word. Why?
I can't answer that to you because I don't ascribe to divine command theory. I don't view the text literally in that way.
It's like, do you believe that these stories even happened?
I mean, there's more plausible reasons to hold that we have to interpret them allegorically or metaphorically than historically. And we know that from the internal. We know that from the internal critique itself. Those are very rigorously.
This is a different. You're derailing Abysmo. I'm pulling you back.
The actual issue.
Here, Abysmo, you're derailing. I'm pulling you back.
I don't think I'm derailing at all. I think you're completely derailed from your own position. You haven't affirmed.
No, dude.
Abysmo, he's taking his time back.
Yeah. I asked you if something was moral. You decided to say that you didn't know whether or not it really happened, and it was allegorical. But what are the next set of questions that I have? And I didn't think I was going to get to all my. I thought I was going to get to all my questions, but I guess not. What we've established so far, at this point, at the very least, is that God is kind of omnibenevolent, I suppose. All good God, which Abysmo doesn't say that we ought to follow. I think he has genocided. The historical accounts say that he has genocided and to kill and wipe other people out. He has permitted owning other people as slaves under certain circumstances. That's the historical account, and that it is okay to almost he has said, under a historical account from someone else, that it is okay to beat a slave half to death, and God has instantly killed a woman who disobeyed him once, but allowed Pharaoh, a man with a hardened heart, to live, even though he had ultimate ignorance to God's word, disobeyed God constantly. But that's going to lead to my next set of questions. I want to see if Abysmo is going to continue to be if he's going to be honest with me, or if he's going to continue to be evasive. Like, what I want to do in the next set of questions is ask him a few. Abysmo, would you be okay with answering a few taboo moral questions, if that's okay?
I mean, I would rather that we talked about what you.
We're going to get to that when it's your turn to answer.
My understanding of moral subjectivity is.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that when it's your turn to ask me questions. That's fine. It's when it's your time.
Taco, how is it not the case where
Dude, stop talking to Taco. Talk to me.
Are we supposed to stay on topic?
So Bubba is asking a line of questions. Please stop ramming into him like that during his cross-examination. He's asking some questions. I'll add another minute because of all the moderation interruptions, but
sure.
Please allow him to get to his points.
if you're asking me if it's okay to ask me taboo questions, I'm not going to promise anything because I don't actually have a reason to promise it until I actually hear, what it is.
Sure.
Right?
You'll hear the questions. They're not made as for how you might answer them.
Okay.
The next one is about the death penalty. Do you think, like, if a person has admitted to and shows no remorse for unaliving a bunch of people and is completely remorseless about it, is the death penalty prescribable to that person?
I am a defender of the death penalty as a rightful power of the state.
Okay, that's fine. And why do you think that?
Because I believe that the civil authority is the right. I mean, so long as there's one presupposition here is that I do believe that human law has a positive dimension to it, and when it comes to capital punishment, whether the state or the governing body has the right to determine a quote unquote, the execution of a person's life, due to criminality and all that sort of stuff. And we can get into the weeds about like psychological reasons why, weighing pain versus harm principle. Like, is it, is it rightful that we, is it justifiable that we would allow, quote unquote, not only the victim but the victim's family to come to some closure, right? Because especially in the cases of murder, it's arguable, and you could justify that.
Abysmo, Bubba's taking that back over.
That's all I'm saying. So, but ultimately,
I don't need to hear a long, drawn out 10-minute conclusion as to why you believe that capital punishment is okay. It's fine.
Why not?
Just like when I asked you why do you think this, I was saying like you believe it because it's rational, you believe it because it's logical. I didn't need a very long manifesto for capital punishment. It's fine. Okay. I think that's the last question because I really don't want you to keep derailing away from the main topic. And I just want to what I want to point out with the reason for this line of questioning is, we remember at the beginning, Abysmo did say that the Bible was more or less a reliable way to know what God's objective moral law was that we ought to follow is. Now, see, the Bible does not directly answer any of those questions about capital punishment, about abortion. It doesn't answer those questions, is why I asked them to Abysmo. And all these things, the only way that you can interpret whether they're good, bad, right, or wrong, since they're not written in God's objective moral law, is from your own subjective lens to draw the conclusion as to what God most likely, probably, considers each to be the case, good, bad, right, and wrong for each of those issues. And before, I want to continue with my next set of questions, if I have time even. I looked at my timer, it's like 29 minutes.
I want to ask you got one more minute.
Way over already.
It's like, at this point,
you have one more minute.
Okay. I don't have time for another minute, but like, can I get another 5 minutes? How would, under an objectivist worldview, would you explain the existence of psychopaths who have no moral law which they follow?
How do I answer this in like 30 seconds? What I would have to say is that there are fundamental and determinative ways that one can attain a set of moral values or even their culture. And that is, I mean, even though that there's wide variation, and just because there's differences in what those cultural values are, doesn't automatically lead to the conclusion that morality is subjective. It could just be the case that we are imperfect human beings that are trying to discover the truth for what it actually is. And the very fact that morality does, in fact, advance and progress, right, seems to suggest that there is an objective moral standard.
That wasn't my question, but that's fine.
Yeah, we're a little bit over time now, so I'm going to go ahead and move it to the next portion, which is going to be Abysmo's cross-examination. Abysmo, let me know when you're ready, and I'll start the timer.
1 second. All right, let's go.
Starting now.
All right, Bubba, do you believe that moral claims express an objective belief, true or false, that someone has?
An objective truth that someone has?
No. Do you believe that moral claims express an objective belief, true or false, that someone has, whether or not you believe that the person who holds it is only subjective in their ascertaining or apprehension of the belief? For them, they could believe that it is objective, right? Just like you're assuming for me.
I believe that if I were to make a moral claim, that does not entail an objective morality. I believe that if I make a moral claim, then I am describing what I believe to be good or bad based on my view of reality. So you're saying, is it clear to assume then that based on your definition that you believe moral claims are just descriptive claims? Descriptive.
And they're not relative in any way to one's culture?
They are relative. They're not prescriptive. Like my view of
No, I said
how I
descriptive.
view.
Because you said
I
that
thought
you
I
don't
thought you said
believe that they're
prescriptive.
objective, that they're just descriptive, right? This is what's known in moral philosophy as like emotivism, right? Like non-cognitivism.
The truth that you hold, the truth that I
you
hold to
don't-
my
go ahead.
position, just the truth that I hold to my
Sorry.
own position doesn't entail that the position is objectively true. If I say that murder is good, that doesn't. If I say murder is good, that doesn't mean that murder is objectively good.
And that truth is relative to you, but is that descriptive or is that a normative belief that you hold? Like, is that just
I wouldn't say
description of like the state of your psychological state, or is it like a normative thing that you believe applies to you and should apply to everybody else, even though you claim that meta-ethically it only applies to you?
I don't think you're using the word meta-ethically correctly, but the
No, I
thing
am.
is,
I'm asking about what your
I know.
foundational belief
I know,
is about moral values.
yeah. So as I said, if I make a claim, if I say murder is bad, then that does not mean that it is objectively bad, and it does come from the first thing that you said, which would be my own psychological state. I was conditioned
And
to
how do you
believe that
assume
murder is
that
bad.
in my case that I would believe that certain beliefs are in fact objective?
You are taking
Do you
the
get the double
negative.
standard here?
You are taking the negative position.
Yeah, but how is it that you're able to hold I mean, under certain types of like quote unquote relativism, like I can see how one might say that, well, how I feel on one particular, issue or observation of moral facts leads me to my own, moral value, but I see that as relative to someone else, right? But wouldn't you still hold that belief, even though it's morally relative to yours, that they hold it to be objectively true?
I don't think that. Again, I just want to say I just have to kind of repeat myself. Is if I say that murder is bad, that doesn't mean that it is objectively bad. So no is the answer to your question.
Okay. Is something said about the world as a matter of fact?
No, as I just said, if I say that murder is bad, then that does not mean that murder is objectively bad.
So you don't believe statements of any kind have any epistemic value?
Some of them, descriptive terms in which we use to
Some
describe
of
the laws
them?
of law, like descriptive, the way that we describe the laws of logic, which objectively exist in the. Okay.
Moving on. Okay, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
That's precisely what I'm getting at. Is I know you're going to go to objective reason and all this stuff, right? So if you believe that logic is objective, transcendentally and across two like relative believers, then anyways, your position seems to be, anyways, expressing or attempting to express true or false claims about reality. How do you feel about this statement? What are your thoughts on this statement?
Depends on the true or false claims.
Okay, all right. Do you believe that it is in the actions and behaviors that determine the claims of moral agents?
No, it is the conditioning of the moral agents. So actions,
Okay.
Actions are kind of part of it. For example, if I were to see my mom kiss my dad, and I would just and they were to express positive feelings to each other, I would interpret that to be a positive behavior. So it's a good thing.
Okay.
If you love someone, then you kiss them. Like that's
Okay.
kind of how conditioning works.
All right, great. Do you think that moral claims rely on the one who speaks the claim or just merely by their actions?
It can be both. I can proclaim that kissing someone is a good thing to do, but if I were just and then showing actions is another way to do so. So both, I suppose.
Yeah, would you agree that if moral claims relied on, both the one who speaks the claim and acts the claim, are we referring to what is acted or spoken, or are we talking about the moral framework that encompasses both the agent's speech and behavior?
So I'm very sorry. Can you repeat the last part of that question?
So if we're saying if you agree that moral claims, right, like the one that you have about what's happening with your parents in this example, if moral claims rely on both the people that are speaking or behaving in a particular way, then we could refer to. I mean, do you think that this is dependent or on the particular person who's speaking or acting as you observe it, their moral framework?
Well, yeah, of course, their moral framework, which extends from the environment, the time and place that they were born in, and which would determine the way that they were the things that they were conditioned to believe.
Okay, and so is this moral framework that you're claiming, is that objective or subjective? Like it's
Subjective.
only for you, or
Are
it's
you
subjective?
lost?
Okay, interesting. Okay. All right. I guess I'm just wondering if there's like problems with this line of thinking, because
I don't think there is.
yeah, because if you're willing to accept that there are moral frameworks, right, that are operative in either the way that you observe things and confirm them to be a moral claim, whether it's for yourself or even for other people. Like, I mean, you can kind of see like you know potential equivocation that can evolve by assuming that you could have a claim to a particular moral framework and someone else can have their own. How do you account for
Yep.
disagreements between different moral frameworks?
How do I account for them? It's very
Yeah.
contextual. For example, I use this. This is a point that I was going to make if I had time. Is that if you have a Muslim, there I see a couple of my Muslim friends in the chat. Hi, if you have a Muslim who is claiming that their moral truth is true, and then you have a Christian who believes that their moral truth is true, the way that you settle it is one thing, which is the question that you're asking me. But the way that they determined it, the only way that you can determine which is correct and which is more correct, comes from your own subjective interpretation of what is good, bad, right, and wrong.
Yeah. All right, moving on. Do you believe that all motivating reasons for morality are internal then?
Yes, believe so. Yeah.
But you just claimed that you were observing other people's moral frameworks, and it didn't just come from your internal state.
The
Or are you saying that it
rationale.
only comes from like your reactions to it?
I'm saying that the rationale that I use and the conclusions that I come to, those are internal. All those things are internal. But yeah, you're
Okay.
right. Like externally, for the example that I
But
gave of
the
mom kissing,
actual normative framework itself, right? The claim that you arrive at, that's not internal.
I do believe that it's internal. The moral framework, a moral framework itself is internal. Like that is a part of your being. That is a
So
the
then,
essence of what makes you
how
you.
did you access the moral framework of your parent?
Yeah, that's
How
what
do
I
you
was.
know that is good?
Yeah, that's
Is
what I
it
was.
good for you?
That's how I would. That's what I was assume that you were asking. For example, like mom kissing dad. That's something that's happening external to
Okay.
myself, and then I conclude it and rationalize it internally.
Okay. Do you believe that if one deems what is moral is just merely pleasurable and useful, for instance, this would mean that this could change daily or on a whim? What internal principle do you have that keeps this from changing arbitrarily?
I think that the idea that morality is based on your preferences is fucking ridiculous, to put it very lightly. The idea that
I'd agree.
the idea that you can just prefer to say that murder is good or murder is bad is ridiculous. And
So, what internal principle would you consider that?
what?
What's the internal principle from, I guess that informs you that it's incredulous that one could assume that morality is just based on preferences, that it could change from one day or when the rain falls, when the wind blows. You're saying that it's incredulous. Right? It's ridiculous for someone to believe that. So then, if you believe, right, excuse me, that all moral facts and our apprehension of them are just based on, internal principles, then what particular internal principle are you saying keeps you from changing your own personal morality arbitrarily?
My morality can change if let's say it can change over time, but the reason I say that preferences is not how it's done is because it's the conditioning process, not preferences.
Yeah.
Preferences just implies things which you like. I can't just like rape and murder. Sorry, non-consensual sex and unaliving people.
Okay, I think we agree on that point. It could just be the case that perhaps both the agent and speaker don't realize that there's a larger culture that determines the truth conditions and meaning in moral frameworks. Do you agree?
It's not just what that determines the conditioning of moral frameworks.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Yeah, it was a question. It was what determines the conditioning of moral frameworks?
The larger culture.
Culture is a big factor. So you said you didn't.
Society.
Yep, the time and place. The time and place in history and the culture, society. That's all.
Okay.
Those are all the biggest influencers of your morality.
Okay, so then that leads to the next logical question, which would be: do you agree at least that if we can't rely, right, on each individual's independent actions and behaviors, where there are individual moral frameworks that we can rely on external normative reasons that could explain or motivate their actions and or behaviors?
When you say external motivating factors, you're referring to like watching, observing other people external to myself behave, correct?
No, I'm talking about the culture of society itself. I mean, that seems to be very common sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that is what the culture is. It's like watching other people, the way that they behave.
You do agree that there are external factors, right, that play into how we even interpret our parents'
Yeah.
behavior, right, based on our culture that's given to
yeah.
us in time and place.
Yes.
yeah.
However, that is not
So it's not
the
wholly
external law.
internal, right?
It is the rationale and the conclusions that you come to are all
So there
internal.
could be so there could be a moral fact that's given to you, right? Like a normative prescription, right? That says like, yo, you should feel this way or do that thing, and you ought to do these things, right? I mean, you haven't necessarily come up with yourself yet, but you either observe it happening in the outside world and it leads to like, good outcomes, or you do it yourself and finally it did bring about good outcomes for you. You don't actually have an internal principle that's going to confirm that that's true, right?
Yeah, it does. My own
Or
rationale.
that you could even come to. Okay, all right, perfect. Okay. Do you think that cultural disagreements between even those individuals within a culture means that morality is subjective?
Yes. Because a strong evidence that I believe a thing that I think is a strong evidence that supports the idea that morality is subjective is that everyone, this is what I didn't get to with my time, was everyone's morality is different. There are no two people that agree on the same moral set.
Okay. Do you think that cultures tend to have wide disagreement on values and duties across cultures?
Do I think it has a wide variety across cultures? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so do you think there are more disagreements across cultures than agreements or similarities?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Do you think cultures can be defined without ambiguity?
Defined without ambiguity.
Yeah. I know it's a broad question.
Define ambiguity.
Yeah, so like, I mean, the nature of or how we terminologically refer to culture is like used very broad. It could refer to countries, it could refer to different subgroups within a particular culture. On Discord, you can find all the different JGCs and like, different guest chat rooms, those could all be like their own internal cultures and stuff. But do you think there's a way to actually define what those cultures are without ambiguity?
You would have to get really pedantic into the way that those people are behaving in order to prescribe. It's not that that's a bad thing. It's just like you would have to really get into the harsh details of the way that each and every person is behaving and find out what they all consider to be moral, and then draw the conclusion of the way that entire JTC, for example, this audience has 50 people. This audience has 50 people.
For example, when it comes to countries, like how would you define countries, without ambiguity? Like different cultures of different, or different cultures of different countries.
What about different cultures in different countries? Like, you can very, very broadly define a culture's morality. Like let's say
based on what?
Like a society of 1,000 people. Like you could say
no. I'm not talking about a hypothetical. Like let's take like Africa and Saudi Arabia. How can you define those without ambiguity?
How can I define those without you would have to be pretty ambiguous. Like it's not ambiguous.
So you are saying that you can't do it without ambiguity?
You would have to be very, very broad to define what they all agree on.
I mean, it seems pretty common sense to me. Like, there are quote unquote external like bodies or institutions that actually determine where those like geographical lines lie. But those wouldn't be like necessarily the only defining features of a particular culture within a country. And then, there's like so many different countries within the African continent as well. Right.
Here's kind of what I'm saying, and I don't know if it's what you're asking me, but here's what I'm saying is that you can look at the consensus of the people and you can say they believe capital punishment.
I didn't refer to no, wrong. No, that's a non sequitur. That has nothing to do with what I was asking. I was asking about, I gave you an example of a case in which you have two different, countries, quote unquote, and there does seem to be like quote unquote common sense external like factors that we could, defer to or refer to in defining like lines between different cultures without ambiguity. That's particularly what I was asking.
Yeah, I don't.
And you're kind of moving to like other social issues rather than the question I was asking.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Yeah. So I'll ask it one more time. Do you believe that that cultures can be defined in a way without ambiguity or not?
The answer is yes, but it's like very, very. You'd have to get to a long list of non-ambiguous,
Great.
ambiguous
That's fine.
terms.
Yeah. I'm not asking you on a specific thing. That's okay. What are the governing lines that separates cultures? If you were to, what comes right off to your mind?
The first thing that came to mind was like borders, but like that's not really.
Yeah, that's
in like Europe, for example, borders don't really. The culture
Let's take that example. Why would those governing lines apply?
Why would those govern? Well, the way that Germany as a whole behaves is very, very different than the way that like France behaves. But there's not much separation between them. And the explanation I would give to that, which is the question that you're asking me, the explanation for that would be, although they are distinct, while they are close countries to one another geographically, they still do hold a different set of moral principles because of the culture. And it's like,
yeah, but that seems pretty ambiguous if you're saying that it's just like a matter of like a consensus of behaviors. Then it just seems like you don't actually have independent moral agents. You just have a bunch of freaking NPCs that are already predetermined to like act in a particular way that identifies them as German. Like it seems like to me more parsimonious, right? And
getting in
less explanation, referring to Occam's principle, to just say, you know what, there are in fact normative factors such as like country boundaries and stuff that determine or define what a quote unquote culture within a particular country is.
That's
rather than
a straw man.
Behaviors could just be deterministic like NPCs.
That's a straw man, and also.
All right, okay. All right, we'll move on.
It's I do kind of want to clarify what you were asking. Like I kind of know what you were asking me, but what I wasn't saying is that borders are the main determiner as to what.
No, that's not what I was saying. What I was saying either, and that would be a form of a straw man. All right. Do you believe that there are some kind of external rules which govern supposed cultural divides and decide where different cultural moral values apply? How is it not setting an objective standard we must abide by beyond the cultural norms themselves?
The first part of your question, the answer was the first part of your question. The answer was borders, where laws come from, where cultures come from.
That's an example you used.
But the moral part is very broad.
Borders by behaviors or an aggregate of behaviors.
Yeah, and I said that was a straw man, but he didn't let me clarify.
Okay, so would you maintain that truth and meaning about a culture's actions, behaviors, norms are relative to their moral frameworks? Are you still maintaining that?
It's, again, like I said in the very first question that you asked me, if I say that murder is bad, that does not mean that it is objectively bad.
I'm not talking about individual cases. We're talking about cultures at this point, because we already agreed that, when it came for where people come up with their moral frameworks, it's based on an external factor of like, quote unquote, their culture or what they're conditioned to, rather than any internal state, right? So why do you keep flipping back to an internal state in order to describe a question about the cultural norms themselves?
I never agreed with that. Do you remember what I said? Were you listening?
Maybe I don't. I'll give you an opportunity to go ahead and recapitulate.
It was that internally, you conclude through your rationale, when mom kisses dad, that is something that is external to myself. That's something I'm not controlling, right? How mom kissing dad, the way that I rationalize that to be a good behavior is something that happens 100% internally. Yeah, a different person could come to the conclusion that mom kissing dad is a bad thing, for whatever reason. So the decider of my morality is myself, based on everything that is internal, my rationale and my conclusions.
So it doesn't seem that you're a cultural relativist anyway. You don't believe that there are moral frameworks that you were conditioned by, that's given to you by your culture, that can influence, whatever norms that you and how you perceive things or observe things. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so damn, we're like back to square one then. So do you believe that it's all determined by behaviors then? The moral values that you hold, is that purely based on like how you perceive your own behaviors and other people's behaviors?
Abysmo,
is it like the behaviors themselves that? Go ahead.
How many questions do you want to ask me? Steelman my position. What did I just say?
You said that your moral framework is limited to the way in which you observe your parents in this example that you provided and their actions and behaviors. So regardless of even what your parents may have thought, maybe they only kissed because they still resented to each other. So what you perceived as like good, they were loving each other, was not really a loving action for them. But you would have no way of telling the difference between that because you have already decided internally to interpret that or observe that and come to a normative description about what the value of that interaction was for yourself, right? And you wouldn't have like an appeal to a cultural way. Well, yeah, normatively speaking, in cultures when people do that type of interaction where they kiss each other, like it is like an act or a sign of them trying to love each other, regardless of how they feel internally.
Yeah, right. So, and I actually
You're
agree
saying
with
that
what
it's like completely in you, like. And the way you determine it is going to be different from the way your parents determine it. Is going to be a way that depends on someone who's not part of your family is going to determine it.
Yep, just like the first thing that I said, just because I interpret it to be a certain way, that does not mean that it's true. Just because I interpret, I'm repeating what you're just saying back to me. We're agreeing right now. My framework is that
so
if mom kisses, I don't steam. Unlike you, I don't steamroll. So
yeah, no. Well, so I mean, if it's the case, right, that you believe that moral values are merely just a matter of internal state, then what internal principle keeps you from changing what your internal state is and how you interpret moral values on a whim arbitrarily? And you're just saying, it's incredulous that anyone's moral values would just change arbitrarily.
That is I want the chat to Google the word incredulous so you can see how falsely he just used that.
That's you said it was ridiculous.
I can respond to that. It's
that. So then, what internal principle keeps you from changing arbitrarily what how you view one particular the moral value of one particular interaction versus another?
It's like this. The conditioning process is a very complex and tedious system. I can't.
Yeah, but an appeal to complexity is not the question that I'm asking you. I'm asking for you an internal principle, right? I'm not asking for you the complicity. This is part of the equivocation, Bubba, is that when I ask you about an internal principle that you hold to be objectively true, or for yourself, or even subjectively true, you're appealing to the complexity of all the external factors. That's the irony of this whole thing.
And I'm not appealing.
What I'm saying is
I didn't make any appeal to the complexity of it. I said that it was I said that it was the conditioning process was very complex.
So you're saying that the internal principle, as you perceive it and observe it in yourself, is complex?
Yes, the conditioning process is very complex. Of course it is. Yes.
Okay, so when you're talking about conditioning, are you talking about cultural values or moral frameworks, or are you talking about your own?
I didn't say that either of those things were complex. I said that the conditioning process was very complex.
So what is the conditioning process? Where are you getting the conditions from?
The conditions externally, right? They're all stimuli.
Do you see how it's very puzzling?
Yeah, that's why I went into psychology. I was very fascinated with this topic.
Yeah, but it didn't seem like you had acknowledged the puzzling nature for you to assume that there can only be an internal framework, and now you're appealing that the conditions themselves do in fact appeal to an external framework.
The conditioning process is the system in which determines your beliefs, and the stimuli is external.
That's within the framework of cultural relativism. But when we got to the point about how cultures themselves to try to determine the moral frameworks for themselves, you said no, it's not actually the culture that's doing it, it's your internal state.
That's not what I said. I said if you go back and replay the video, whoever's watching this in the future, I actually said that culture, time and place you were born in.
Okay, fine.
Are you gonna let me finish a single answer?
Hey, Abysmo, to be fair, you did go on quite a bit. He would like to clarify his point. Please allow him a moment to clarify his point.
How much time do I have, Taco?
About 3 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, 5, great.
I wish I could go back and clarify a dozen points, because it doesn't let me finish a single fucking point. But the point that I just made is I didn't say that culture is the main determiner of your beliefs. It is the biggest determiner. Usually my culture would be the time and place I was born in, external stuff, the way that other people behave. But the biggest thing would probably be my direct family members, the people who are the closest people to me. Those aren't exactly.
Wait. Didn't you just say the biggest thing was the culture that conditioned, and now you're saying it's actually your internal state?
Right. Yeah. What I meant is the biggest thing is different than the way that you're applying that. I understand how that would be confusing. Like
No, I'm confused
Yeah.
because I don't think that you're being clear about the way that you're applying
Here.
biggest.
Here, allow me to be. So
I mean, that's the same thing as saying that God is omnipotent.
Yeah. So when I
Because
say
you were just saying that bigger when it comes to cultural conditioning, and then now you're saying that is bigger when it comes to like your internal state. And how
can you let
interpret
me?
Nope, we're gonna move on. How about Bubba? Clarifying question. Do you think it's fair to say, okay, so is it or not that you believe that the cultural conditioning is a bigger factor in an individual's moral framework, or is it the agent's internal framework itself that is the biggest factor in determining moral values?
They're not the same exactly. Like
I know that's not the question I asked. I'm not asking about
Yeah.
sameness or difference. I'm asking about bigger because that's your words.
Yeah, I know. So when I said, can I clarify? You just said I can't clarify uninterrupted, so I'll give it my best shot. It's that the biggest determiner is going to be the culture, the time and place that you were born.
Okay, great. All right, let's move on. All right, okay, got it.
And then the next thing was going to be the family.
I'm taking my time back.
Okay.
Do you believe there are some kind of external rules which govern supposed cultural divides and decide where different cultural moral values apply? How is it that not setting an objective
How many questions
standard?
are you going to fucking ask me? Can you ask me one question at a time?
Okay, all right, fine, that's it. All right, okay, we'll move on. If you think that
I didn't even answer you.
So is it clear that you believe that is the greater case that your quote unquote moral values are set by your cultural moral framework?
Did you say more? Like by my cultural moral framework?
Right, that the culture itself, right, has a greater effect in determining your moral framework.
So it looks like this. The people that affect me the most are the people that I have the most direct access to. That would be my mom, my dad, maybe my siblings, and maybe like my classmates.
So it's just
but then the thing that affects
begging the
them,
question. That's just begging the question. Do you believe that when you interpret their behavior, that they are working according to their own personal moral frameworks that are conditioned on a culture, or just their internal state? That's why I asked you, do you believe that a greater impact on an individual agent's moral framework is the culture, or is it their individual state?
It's like, dude, you're losing the plot.
I'm not losing the plot at all. I'm just trying to clarify. You're not taking a position. That's a problem with your dilemma.
Asked me you just asked me three questions. Which one do you want me to answer?
Is it fair to assume, Bubba, that you believe that the culture conditions, by the conditioning, right? It appeals to the culture to provide you a moral framework, and that is greater, regardless of time or space, right? You're a product of your time and place. This seems very obvious for most people. That's what I'm saying. And we can't even get beyond the most obvious points. That's something that I won't even disagree with.
1 minute?
It's far too late for this. There's only 1 minute left, but I want to show the chat.
Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Abysmo. What I mean when I say,
can I have my time back?
Please,
can I have my time back?
Please respond to the question real fast.
His question was, do I think that it's the culture, the time and place that you were born into, is the biggest factor of what determines your morality? The answer is yes, but
great. Okay, time back, please. Okay. If you think that morality is merely relative to culture or society, then do you believe that it is possible to have moral agents within that society or culture to be acknowledged as a virtuous moral reformer?
To reform it? Yeah, Martin Luther King.
Okay, perfect. If you believe that, right, then if you as a moral subjectivist believe that, then how can you maintain that it was virtuous for him to be a moral reformer if at that time and place, given the conditioning of his society and culture, it was not morally acceptable to be against segregation?
Yep, I will answer that question.
That's time. So let Bubba respond to the last question, and then we'll move to
my cross-examination. It is kind of like how the winners are the ones who write history. So the answer is, in hindsight, we know that Martin Luther King was right and racism is bad, because that's the way that a society has formed over time to his beliefs. And in the 1950s and 60s, it was a bad thing, in hindsight, to say that black people were, inhuman in the way that they were being treated. And that's the very basic answer to his question. He can throw a tantrum all he wants.
Okay, perfect. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the Q&A. I'm not sure whose hand was raised first, but I'm going to pull up a few questions from the chat, and then we'll move on to the audience here and pull them up as well. I do have a few questions in chat. So, Abysmo, does culture change? This is from Brilliant.
What I would say is that culture does advance and makes moral progress. And that's because of some external principle outside of the culture itself rather than internally from any individual agent or the cultural norms within it. That's historically demonstrable and pretty common sense.
Gotcha. And then Numenon has a question for both of you. We'll start with Bubba because he's on the left, and then Abysmo because he's on the right. Well, I guess it's affirmative and negative as well. But how can you know that you didn't accidentally turn yourself into a brain in a vat and then forget you did so? That's Bubba first.
Oh, wait. How can you know that you didn't turn yourself into a brain in a vat?
And then
Through
forget
my
you
own
did
rationale
so.
and forget I did so. I believe that the correct answer is that it's not possible to know that for sure, but I would personally conclude, based on my own experience of reality, which comes from my empiricism and rationalism, that I think, therefore I am. Everyone here knows that statement, but I can conclude that I am not in a brain in a vat. Even if I was, even if I was, then I still am a living human being.
Gotcha. And then Abysmo?
I'm sorry, what was the question again? I was reading the chat.
How can you know that you didn't How can you know that you didn't accidentally turn yourself into a brain in a vat and then forget you did so?
Because I mean, I'll use G.E. Moore's argument in this one, even though I don't believe in objective intuitionalism or whatever, is that if I put, one hand in front of me and I have a second hand, then I know that the external world is real.
Gotcha. And then this is another question for both, so we'll go left to right again. What is the epistemic methodology by which you determine the noumenal reality of normativity without appealing to a theory that traps you in underdetermination of data?
Is that question to me?
That's for both of y'all. So Bubba first and then Abysmo.
Okay, sure. That's a really convoluted question.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, I'm
I don't know
not
if
going to
you're
lie.
track that.
Yeah, no, I can't track that. I honestly, genuinely don't know what he was asking, just because I'm very susceptible to jargon like that.
Can you type it out in the side chat whoever asked that question?
John, go ahead and restate that a little bit more simple for them, and then I'll just move on to the next one for right now. Abysmo's refutation to genocide in the Bible was insufficient, so he's asking, this is oat oil, why would a divinely inspired author say God commanded genocide knowing this will be scripture and instruction for future generations?
Can you restate that again? I'm having a hard time following that as well.
Yeah, why would a divinely inspired author say God commanded genocide knowing this will be scripture and instruction for future generations?
Right. Unfortunately, we weren't actually able to get that part into the cross-examination because we got so hung up on whether or not Bubba actually did ascribe that the moral frameworks are provided by the cultures or not, which I was hoping to try to elucidate. To the further point that it could be the case, right? Just because we have cultural disagreements, right? And regardless of how you want to delineate, because there's so many different ways to try to establish one type of culture from another culture, but that a lot of the times those aren't really on the same level either, right? But regardless of those disagreements don't necessarily, provide evidence that, morality is just all subjective. It could just be the case that, we haven't actually discovered, the actual objective moral standard. And that's kind of what I would maintain when it comes to quote unquote Old Testament, agrarian economies, of the past. That's all I have to say.
Gotcha.
They could have just in other words, they could have just gotten the moral facts wrong. And one of those moral facts would have included how they received a quote unquote command of God. You have plenty of people who claim that they're freaking Jesus. You have people in Africa who believes that they're freaking Jesus, and 1 million people believe in them.
Gotcha. And
that doesn't change the fact that God could, in fact, be something external to the material world. This is it's just begging the question. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, and then
I was gonna say for the record, Taco, I think Sammy and Weetod are the ones that have had their hands raised the longest. I think.
I'll pull people up here shortly.
Okay.
And that other question seems to be asking, how can we know what moral truths exist beyond our perceptions without ending up with multiple competing theories that we can't decide between?
Go ahead,
Bubba. Who was that for? It was for both of us?
Go ahead, Bubba.
Yeah, that was the one for both y'all. And he can clarify further if he wants.
Yeah, can you clarify the
Oh,
question?
no, he hasn't responded. I was just parsing that.
The question, sorry, like what I mean is the question
So,
was
like, how do you figure out the true nature of moral or normative reality? Like, what's truly right, wrong, necessary, without relying on a method that leaves you stuck with too little evidence to decide between different theories?
Yeah, that is presupposing that there is an objective moral truth. Of course, I don't believe that there is an objective moral truth. The only thing that is morally true is what you conclude it to be. So, um, the only thing that should determine what is good, bad, right, and wrong is murder bad, is genocide bad, should be yourself. It's and I don't, and that's what aligns with my worldview. And Abysmo will say something else.
Gotcha. And then
Yeah, I
Abysmo?
mean, I'm going to defer to, I guess like the best approach that I could have a question like that is I'm going to appeal to Noam Chomsky, okay? So, I mean, it's pretty clear that cultural relativism, does, is kind of like a, uncontrovertible form, right? But the real question is that is there an external principle outside that? And I wouldn't necessarily call that question begging, because the reason why is because, like, even when it comes down to like, even if we were to accept that moral relativism is just based on a broad spectrum of like different forms or whatever, cultural relativism being one of them, even in the tense, even in like, for individuals, there's like different aspects within human nature that can vary widely, right? Like, for example, a visual system, right? So I'm going to make an epistemological appeal here, right? Visual systems can vary widely depending on early experience. Human visual systems can vary in terms of number of receptors that can influence our sight, right? But human visual system can't be changed into an insect visual system because these are generalized facts of biology. We know that the genetic structure or plan, quote unquote, for an insect is going to be different from a human. So there are logical limitations there, or I wouldn't say like logical limitations, but limitations that are derived from the biological facts themselves, right? That determines what kind of sight a human can have versus an insect, right? Um, in a lot of ways, the ways in which that we're able to ascertain moral values, even ones given by a culture, are already are we it points to the fact that we have an innate, sense of that is not only like fundamental, but is determinative, right? Like the way that we use language. How do we access a culture? We access it through language, right? How do we access mathematics? It's going to be literally an innate sense. If you're going to say that the normative facts themselves.
Okay. And then we'll move on to this. I do have more text questions, but I'll try to pull up some people in the audience first before we get to that, just to make sure we have time for everybody, because these other questions are for Abysmo. So I'll pull up Ego first, because it looks like his hand was the first one raised.
Hello, good evening.
Hey, Ego.
Yo.
Yeah. I only came in into the later bit. I missed the first 30 minutes, so feel free to correct me if I make a dumb statement, right? My question's a pretty simple one. I'm just going to appeal to moral skepticism in that I just don't see how... I'm sure you're familiar with the moral queerness argument, right, Abysmo?
Mm-hmm.
So for me,
theory,
a major... Yeah. Sorry, pardon?
Go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
That's okay. Maybe it's good if we present it for the audience, if you want to, Abysmo, just to articulate it.
Yeah, just a moment.
I can do it if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
So,
yeah, I could do it right now. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
So, yeah, the argument for moral queerness would be that if objective values were to be strange in comparison to anything else that we know exists, because everything else can be studied empirically. So, like, this is the presumption that if we're to assume that morality is somehow accessible to us through some innate sense or something like this that we all have access to, it's not in the same way as any quote unquote empirical fact, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand what your retort there is. I think
how about I let you
perception,
clarify? Go ahead.
they're part of the phenomenal perception, but doesn't mean they comport to the noumenal.
Okay.
Like an answer. Am I confused?
What's your question, I guess?
Anyways, maybe it's better if we just like.
Okay, let me try again.
Um,
Let me try again to reframe just out of fairness, Ego. I don't want to just like kind of leave you out there. The way I understand the moral queerness argument from error theory is that it would be quote unquote queer to hold that we have some other way, right, of innately quote unquote perceiving, which is used metaphorically, moral facts about the world that's different from our quote unquote 5 or 6 senses,
Yeah, sorry.
right, which are
I think I
observable,
missed.
right? That's how we determine descriptive facts about the world, right?
Yeah,
Whereas,
yeah.
right, the criticism of the error theorist about quote unquote moral realism is that how is it that we can have access, right? That's a more fundamental question. How is it that we have access to this quote unquote objective standard of moral facts and values?
Yeah, and
Right.
so for me,
And one would be to
it's like,
this
oh, sorry,
objection.
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. Expand.
For me, it's like the answer is just God, right? But I don't believe in God. Or for me, the answer would be natural features of the world, right? Like when I have a conversation with somebody and I ask them, "Do you have a dog?" They can show me a picture of a dog, right? That's still an
And it's
interpretive
verifiable,
process,
right?
Sorry, go ahead. What do you say?
No. I'm sorry. I keep interjecting.
It's okay. So like for me, that's like obviously I'm being reductive here, right? Because I'm not gonna like give you an 800-page essay on empiricism, but my point is, right, that when it comes to things that are empirical of nature, they still require interpretation. That's another very complicated conversation, but I'm putting that on the table, right? But if you show me a picture of your dog, there's like a correspondence relationship there to reality. And so there's an epistemic pathway towards a fact, what we would normatively call a fact, in my opinion. So how do we do that for moral objectivity? Now, if you're going to appeal to moral universalism, I don't think that like goes true. Just putting that on the table. Because I think
I already said at the start, I'm not a moral universalist. I don't think there's generalized principles outside of the moral facts that we're able to observe for ourselves that determine how we're morally to act. I don't believe that at all. So, like, again, I'm not a divine command theorist. If anything, I'm very suspicious of those kind of prescriptions.
But you believe in moral realism, right?
Yes, I do. But there's many different types of moral realism. That's the thing.
Okay. Can you please like
how does moral realism, or would you like me to respond to the objection of queerness
like,
from
moral facts, right? Like there are factual components. Like even if a certain moral statement isn't like a factual statement, there are like truth tracking elements to that statement, right? Like for example, punching a baby.
Yeah, like my personal view is, I'm actually kind of split on like moral realism. Is it non-natural? Is it natural? I think you can have like a healthy hybrid and an appeal to both in a lot of cases, because there are those fundamental biologically quote unquote structured or predetermined aspects about the way that we even come to perceive things. That can be predeterminate causes for how we're able to observe the facts in the first place, and should take into account, right, like how we should go about coming up with or ascribing, not prescribing, to particular moral norms, right? Like case in point, it's precisely because I believe in objective morality that when I look at like Alan Turing, right, and how there used to be quote unquote normative laws determining that homosexuality was a disease. We know now that those facts are fucking wrong. But I can only say that they're wrong by appealing to objective facts about the matter. You see what I mean?
Well, I
might have other normative determinations how I feel about homosexuality, normative speaking. Yeah, that's...
Yes, let's not yawn very loudly.
It's pretty clear that regardless of quote unquote your theological or other intuitive proclivities, even at the time of Alan Turing, their analysis of the moral facts as it was prescribed by the quote-unquote normative laws of that society and culture were wrong. But you can only come to that through an appeal to an objective standard, and not just the intuition or internal states of like either an individual or aggregate of individuals. That seems very common sense.
Genuinely not trying to strawman you, but like my brain interpreted this in 2 sentences. He appeals to my intuition, right? He appeals to like things that we share like intuitively in common, and then like the contrary is impossible. Like I still didn't get like a truth tracking property here.
A truth tracking property.
Yeah.
So like, is homosexuality a disease in this example?
I think
what kind of facts would you appeal to strengthen that claim?
Well,
that makes it more plausible the case.
Foucault actually has like a whole ass book on this, right?
Yeah.
Like the history of sexuality and crime and punishment, right?
But what does he say?
Well, he thinks it's a genealogical development in how we medicalize and see and perceive like certain social acts, right? So, for
Yeah, but what I'm
example,
asking is how does one come, right? Like, what facts does one appeal to try to make a normative claim that it is a disease in the first place? What I'm saying is that
you're
seems
making
totally
a
implausible to me, and
yeah,
that's why
'cause
they
you're
got the
making a
fact wrong.
category error. Because you're making a category error.
All right,
How is that
Ego.
a category?
Ego, go ahead and make your last point, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the
No,
next
no,
question.
that's fine. I think Ego's doing a great job.
Yeah, we have
Um,
other people that need to get up here too.
Okay.
Well, like I call it a category error because in my I already have a framework where I don't believe in bad and good, and now you're asking me how do you know that like being gay was wrong objectively in your I just don't understand. That's just a category error. Maybe I misunderstood, but
Well, that's why I was trying to like appeal to other things. There's things that depending on the set or what you would consider sources of like moral facts, the quote unquote normative understanding or values is going to vary dependent on that, right? But as far as
Okay.
as it was prescribed to be a disease by early 20th century British culture, I would
Mhm.
say that they had the facts wrong. It's not a disease. And
Okay.
that and I'm not going to go into the theological point because that's not what this question is about. What am
Sure.
I appealing to? Yes, I am appealing to an objective standard. If you're asking for me how it is that I come to that objective standard, it's pretty clear to me from the facts that we can't consider it as these. There's all other biological predeterminants. Evolution itself, if you adopt the principles of evolution, yes, genetic expression is pretty diverse and varied, right? And that's kind of the
Okay.
point I was trying to make with Bubba earlier, is that the fact that they're varied isn't actually evidence that morality is subjective in any way. It could just be the case that it hasn't been perfected yet. In the epistemological sense, quote unquote, in some normative theories of value, we would say that there are quote unquote material evils in the world. You get what I mean?
I
But
think
that's
I
not the same
understand.
type of question as
But
far as how are we supposed to treat people as quote unquote free agents and human beings? You get what I mean?
yeah,
I
I
think that
understand. But
distinction is important.
it is, but unfortunately, Abysmo, even though I would love to explore your view more, I'm just going to
Mhm.
respectfully bow out.
No
Thank you.
Thank you,
worries,
Ego.
Ego. Thank you, man. I appreciate it, Ego. You helped me clarify a lot of things.
Yeah, no worries, man. Anytime. Take care.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate you come up. So we do have Zed next in queue. However, JL has actually been asking me in DMs and on Discord and on YouTube since the middle of the Q&A. And he had his hand up, so I'll pull him up now. He had some issues with his phone there.
Hey, Joe. You had a great debate yesterday, JL.
JL, I think you got to hit your
Hello?
hotkey.
Mr. Warren, sir.
There it goes. Oh. Say something? We cannot hear anything. Okay,
Maybe
go.
I can see. I think I saw JL right in the side chat his question. Yeah, here it is. I found his question. Want me to say it?
What we'll do is we'll give him another chance here in a second. I'll pull up the next person, JL. I would recommend backing out of Discord and then relaunching it. That will probably fix it. We'll pull up Zen in the meantime.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Good name, 10 out of 10.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Yep, we can.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have two questions to Abysmo. So first thing, if you don't accept divine commentary as your basis for moral objectivity, then on what consistent non-arbitrary principle do you decide which biblical passages reflect objectively true morality and which are dismissible because you said, quote unquote, some of them you weren't there to witness them, so you don't know?
Mhm.
Doesn't that selective process amount to special pleading? Basically, you're applying one criterion to some passages but not to others, and cherry picking the evidence that fits your conclusion?
Well, okay, great. Thank you very much. What was the second question, or was the second question within that question?
That was one question with
Yeah.
two question marks.
Okay.
Also.
So you're asking if I quote unquote reject divine command theory or am at least suspicious of it, then what
So
criterion?
you say you're
of moral...
skeptical, right?
Yeah. What criterion of moral theory would I have for Christianity as it applies to the Bible? Like,
No.
if,
What I'm asking is that if you are, let's say, skeptical of divine command theory, right, as your basis for moral objectivity, then what is it that's the consistent, non-arbitrary principle that you use to decide which biblical passages reflect objectively true morality and which are dismissible because you weren't there to witness them? Because you add an example that Bubba brought to you at the end of his time. I think it was about Moses, and you said you don't know because you weren't there to witness it, right?
Right.
But to me, like, it sort of like makes me want to ask a question, you know, like, doesn't that selective process amount to special pleading? Because you're applying one criterion to some passages, but not to others. And that
Correct.
also implies cherry picking the evidence that fits your conclusion.
Well, that would actually be a form of special pleading if you were assuming that that you would have to be limited to one set of criterion in order to establish or in order to quote unquote interpret or approach or access one set of facts versus another facts, right? There's a distinction between descriptive facts versus normative facts. Would you agree?
How's that relevant?
It is relevant for a lot of reasons. Like scientific, that's literally the heart of David Hume's case, right? How do you get from an is to an ought? Just because we could describe certain things in a certain way, epistemologically speaking, doesn't necessarily lead us to like an ought statement about how we morally should act.
Yeah, but I meant like, how does this relevant to your principle?
Right, but the distinction between descriptive facts and normative facts is extremely important. That's why I'm quote unquote, normatively speaking, very skeptical of claims about divine command.
Yeah, I understand that, but what I'm asking is your principle. What is it that you're doing to be able, right, to apply one criterion to some passages but not to others? How do you determine this?
Right, you would have to try to delineate what are actually descriptive claims versus what could be counted as in favor of quote unquote facts that could influence normative.
Yeah, how do you do that?
That's the idea. Well, so you're asking, right? So here's precisely the thing: is maybe it's because one could be not aware with the subject matter when it comes to, I guess, like the science or the methods of inquiry as it regards textual interpretation, which that is more of like an epistemic domain. That's within an epistemic domain, right? Whereas normative claims are not, because normative claims have to do precisely with how we should quote unquote hold to particular values or quote unquote even virtues about how people should act, rather than how we interpret a particular phrase given at a particular time or context, or archaeological evidence that could provide plausibility of what kind of assumptions we could bring to the freaking text in the first place.
Let's say that. Sorry, it's just like it seems to me you're not answering my question though, because
I don't think no. I mean, it could just be the case that you're just wholly unaware of what it means to do like a quote unquote biblical exegesis or hermeneutic in the first place, and you're just conflating that with normative claims when it comes to morality.
Okay, so that's what you're using to determine.
Well, when it comes to determining what quote unquote normative actions I should take given my time and place, then yeah, it's going to go through a filter of quote unquote, normative criterion by which I do that, and not just the hermeneutical ones. The hermeneutical ones could give me a more plausible interpretation or understanding of what the text actually is saying, right? But then it's a whole nother thing of moral analysis then into how that translates into what we should do practically in our daily living in today's time. You get what I'm saying? And that's an important distinction that has to do, as David Hume, alludes to, there is a real distinction between is and ought claims. And it would be puzzling for and intellectually honest for someone not to actually treat that as seriously of a distinction in the first place.
Yeah, I hear what I listen to what you said and I understand it, but I don't understand how it applies to you being able to distinguish between X and Y biblical passage.
Well, then, are you asking about how I go about interpreting the scripture? Because that's
Yeah,
what
I'm asking
saying is
you,
that
how are you not doing? How are you not special pleading or cherry picking? Right. So you need
I'm
to
not
explain to
special
me
pleading because hermeneutic is going to be like within the domain of epistemology. If we take the text, right, as an empirical fact, right, that has certain quote unquote things that it says or meanings, then I'm going to bring a whole different type of, or a separate analytical domain, right, of way of us approaching the text in order to establish what the most plausible interpretation of given texts or passages are from how I'm going to derive that to how I should act today.
So you said you
That
base
seems
yourself
very
off
common
first
sense
on
to
an
me.
assumption. So you start with an assumption, and then
Which
you
assumption would that be? Which assumption would that be?
Well, I don't know. That's what you're saying.
No, I mean, in this case, I guess you could say, like, if you're looking for some, like, quote unquote, unified, quote unquote, field theory for how we're able to move from different applications of logic versus another, the only thing that I would say that I would superimpose in this position is the objectivity of reason itself, which is also the basis for, quote unquote, ethical normativity.
You're talking about the logic is prescriptive?
Not necessarily, not in all cases. Logic is, you could say that it actually supersedes those things because I hold it as objective, whereas prescriptions may not necessarily be objective. They could be subjective prescriptions. And that's why I am suspicious of quote unquote divine command theory. How am I supposed to epistemically determine whether or not it actually comes from God or it just comes from a human person saying that they're speaking in God's name? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, it
That's an
sounds like
important
cherry
distinction.
picking and
That's
special pleading. Yeah.
I don't think that's cherry picking at all. I think you're straw manning my position to assume
No,
that if one believes in God, then one has to also believe in the people that claim that they actually come from God. You get what I'm saying here?
no,
Is that
no,
just
no,
how I
no.
feel?
The reason why I'm saying that I'm not strawmanning you, right, is that once again you're applying one criterion to some passages but not to others, and you're not explaining the methodology clearly how it
Well,
is
let
that
me
you're
ask
able to
you:
distinguish.
Do you believe that because reason applies in one domain, that it also that the same logic applies in another domain?
If I don't answer your question, are you going to be unable to answer mine?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's actually you're fucking thing.
That's precisely because your question would be a form of special pleading,
Oh God.
right? So you're going to be undermining yourself if
All
you
right,
don't.
I'm done.
You don't
I'm done. I
clarify
proved my point.
what you mean by
I'm
logic.
happy.
All right.
Thank
You're
you.
Thank you,
asking
Zen.
about my opinion on logic, and I provided it, which is that it's objective.
Oh,
It's
we love
something
you.
that is stance independent, and you could
We
say
love
it's
you, Abysmo.
fundamental to everybody.
Okay.
We love you, Abysmo.
And
Never
we're,
change,
we're
man.
coming up on the 30-minute timer I had set for this. Are you guys okay with taking some additional questions beyond that?
Absolutely, Taco.
Cool.
If we have people, we need to, satisfy the people.
Cool.
Able to get up. Abysmo, I have a question for you. I'll try to make this succinct so that we don't, or try to, I want to get a straightforward answer. So, but here we go. If God is defined as a mind that is ultimate, basically the set from which the not God set is actualized, this would entail that nothing exists external of the God set or the God itself that it must necessarily reference for the mental content that would be needed to make the distinctions that it is making coherent. So then how do you reconcile, with this definition of God, how do you reconcile the logical contradiction of a mind that references nothing for coherency being simultaneously posited as a source for mind-independently true moral valuations?
That's a very good question. All I would say is that, usually when we construct the quote unquote God as a divine mind theory within ontology, St. Thomas Aquinas makes it very, very clear that we're only assuming these quote unquote normative, or should I say, epistemological. I don't want to even call it epistemological or metaphysical, right? I know you're asking a metaphysical question. Is that fair to say, JL?
The idea, well, in a sense, because hang on a second, just to clarify. To clarify your question, because what you asked me, it's not really that simple. The idea being that the ontology of that which is good and that which is not good. If you want to appeal to God as being that which is good, and basically all you're stating is God is good is God, therefore God is God, it's just tautological. But the problem is that
that's the problem.
to establish the identity of what good is, you need to understand what the identity of not good is so that you can understand the two as being distinctly coherent as oppositional positions. But if that which doesn't exist that is not good is a referent for that which is good, then
Right, without verifiability, it could just be nothing. I totally understand that. That's the interplay between
Okay.
G.E. Moore's position about how to define the good in the first place, and then you have the emotivist claim. A.J. Ayer actually respond to it, right? Which is that's precisely what I'm talking about. That was you have to at least be able to acknowledge the puzzling way in which we can apperceive, ethical moral facts in the first
that's what I'm
place in order to
asking.
be
How
serious
do you
about it, right?
reconcile the
Right,
how
but
do you
when it
reconcile the contradiction though?
Right. With God, I mean, in one sense, I believe, okay, and I may be unfair in saying this, and I'm only following St. Thomas Aquinas on this. We can talk about like Neotomism, whatever, if you feel it's relevant. But, according to St. Thomas, the ways in which we, by our own words, just try to describe the mind of God is only analogically because we only have words based on our contingent ability to know anything about the universe to formulate the words in the first place. So our quote unquote words are already conditioned by a mind that relies on contingent facts about the world. That is not the case, quote unquote, metaphysically, and that's the assertion that is given to faith or certainty, that we have faith that God's mind doesn't operate in an analogous way, or that God's mind doesn't operate in a contingent way as ours, but we can, in an analogous way, try to apply descriptive terms as we experience it here, upon God, but we do it in a superlative and maximally great way.
That
That's the best
doesn't reconcile the contradiction. You just basically said it's an appeal
What
to mystery.
contradiction?
Well, hang on, I'm not
What's
done.
the
I'm not
contradiction?
done.
Okay,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
done speaking. I'm not done finishing. I'm just trying to make it quick, so I don't want you to jump over me. So it doesn't
sorry.
reconcile the contradiction of what I presented in my question. You're basically just saying you can appeal to mystery, that there's a way that God does it, but we just don't know it. But we can analogize it by the way that we do it in the real world, and we can just
But I'm not the one. I'm not the one begging the question because I'm not. So
I'm not begging the question. I'm not assuming the truth of my conclusion, my premises.
I'm not saying that you're begging the question either, Jail. What I'm saying is that I'm actually not the one that's presupposing that we can somehow come up with like an epistemological proof for the existence of God,
either.
and thereby the conditions of knowability in the first place for how it is in the mind of God. That's precisely. That's why I answered in a particular way, right? Because you're not asking a question about the physical order of things. You're asking a metaphysical question about
how we question. You're steamrolling
Yes.
me, and I asked you a direct question. You haven't reconciled the contradiction. I'll make it one last time, and then I'll get get out of here. So move on to the next person. How do you reconcile the contradiction of a mind that references nothing external of itself for the mental content to make coherent distinctions because nothing exists for it to reference? How do you reconcile positing that thing is simultaneously
because
a source
when it comes
for
to the mind of God,
I'm not done.
and we're
I'm not done.
Abysmo, please allow him to
How
finish.
do you reconcile positing that thing is simultaneously a source for mind-independent moral valuations?
Yeah, I mean, we're not saying that in the mind of God that quote unquote moral values or facts or goods, even in themselves, that are going to be external to Him. That would be begging the question because
it's not begging the question. It's not assuming the truth of the
JL.
It's not assuming. Stop, Abysmo. You keep saying begging the question. Abysmo. You keep saying begging the question.
Hey, guys, let's stop yelling at each other.
No, Abysmo.
That is not what the Catholic metaphysical position is about the nature of God as a mind.
It's not. No, it's not.
God
it's reconciling
is
a logical
purist, so we maintain divine simplicity, right? You're begging the question of whether or not
I'm not.
there's
It's
some
not
other
assuming the
sort of
truth.
moral fact that God is contingent
one at a time.
upon in order to draw conclusions about an
me?
external world to Him.
Can you stop misrepresenting me?
That's what you're doing, JL.
No, I'm not. I'm not assuming the truth of my conclusion and my premises.
Okay. Allow Jail to clarify real fast. He said that you misrepresented his position, and you said no, so allow him to clarify, and then you guys can determine. But let's go one at a time.
It's really simple. How can a mind that references nothing external of itself to make coherent distinctions simultaneously be a source for mind-independent moral valuations? How can that possibly be?
Because the truth is always asymmetrical to those that are contingent.
It doesn't answer the question, Because
It
there's
does.
nothing.
It
There's nothing.
does.
The God
You're
itself is not
asking a
contingent. It
metaphysical
doesn't rely on
question.
anything.
I'm giving you a metaphysical answer. Unless
not
you
a
want to beg the
metaphysical
question.
answer. You
No,
didn't.
unless
It's a
you
complete
want
dodge.
to ask a physical question, which presupposes contingency within God.
It's not proposing contingency. It's saying that nothing, by virtue of the theistic worldview, nothing exists external of the God to act as a referent for coherency or even mental content. So if the God is arbitrarily and subjectively dictating that which is good
No,
is
you're
that which it wants, and that which is
You're
I'm not
strawmanning the
done.
position.
I'm not done. It is logically entailed by the theistic worldview that if nothing exists external of the God, then anything it dictates because it wants, not because it must. And therefore, any distinctions it makes arbitrarily and subjectively because it's not referencing anything external of itself as to what things must necessarily be. So therefore, if it is a mind that is ultimate, and it's arbitrarily and subjectively making these distinctions in accordance with its own subjective interpretations of what it wants, and how can you simultaneously call that thing a source for mind-independent moral valuations when those distinctions and those valuations are only coming from its mind? The two things cannot be simultaneously. It's a logical contradiction. I'm asking you how you reconcile that, and you haven't done it. And I don't think you can. So I'm
now
good.
allow him to respond, Jail. Okay.
Can I respond?
Well, yes, you can respond now.
The thing is I
You can
reject your
head
first
off
premise
if you want,
because
Jail.
you assume that a quote unquote mind independent quote of mind entity is going to be in some, it can't quote unquote by its very nature have some things other than it. That is not the principle of mind that we're talking about. You need to go review Plotinus, J.R. Warren. Those are the preambles of faith that we regard that are totally accessible. We can know the preambles of the faith through the light of human reason alone. Go revisit Plotinus.
Okay, and then the next person in the queue is Sammy.
Woo! I love Sammy.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Sammy, I want you to know I'm in
Hey,
love
Sammy.
with you.
Who's your question for?
Abysmo. Abysmo, you're using a lot of flowery language, so I just felt you were very disingenuous. I just want to ask this question to find out if you were actually being genuine. I want you to use
Well,
your...
no, hold on. I have to stop you there. Why are you jumping straight into ad hom, Sammy?
No. This is my suspicion.
No. Here's the thing. I don't feel like I have any normative obligations to you if you engage me at the level of character rather than of the content of your,
Guys,
whatever you have to say.
Abysmo.
Why couldn't you have just started with your claim first, Sammy?
So let's just ask the
Quite the
question, Sammy.
Okay, I want you to use objective reality, like your Catholic background, to answer this question. You have one liver, and you have 3 patients. One is a 5-year-old girl, one is a mother with 3 babies, and one is a fat man who gives to hospital charities. Who gets the liver? And use your objective reality to really justify it. And I want to reply to that as well.
I mean, it's interesting with these kind of like very abstract level of like moral quandaries. I think the project of what how one actually ascertains moral objectivity relies actually for its factual basis relies less on quote unquote abstract hypothetical like mind theories or whatever in order to determine how it is that we could create the actual people who are going to make the right choice in the first place.
Okay, but who would you choose and justify it with the objective morality from Catholicism?
No. Well, here's the thing, Sammy. The trolley problem itself already presupposes that there is some objective moral standard. The question is a utilitarian problem, right? And utilitarianism is trying to, quote unquote, rationalize or formulate an objective criterion or standard in the first place, because the assumption is, or the presupposition is that, in fact, that the greatest happiness, whatever actions derive the greatest happiness, is what is in fact objective. Right?
And could you at least try?
Sidgwick tried to answer, right, what kind of rational basis that we could have in the first place to establish that is a fundamental principle in the first place. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful, right? Which is why in mid-20th century moral philosophy, we tried to focus more on the practical issues, like even casuistic ones you can call in applied ethics, to try to determine how we could actually come up with the people who are going to make the right choices, in the first place, given that set of circumstances. Having said that, my claim is not a universal claim about moral objectivity. There's obviously different types of situations. Like if we're going to get into situational ethics and casuistry, because that's kind of, I guess that's what I'll have to appeal to address your question. An example that I think a more pertinent and practical and relevant example that I can give to try to, give you a perspective on how I'm going to view, this type of a question, especially as it relates to like trolley problem, is what happens in a nuclear launch scenario. For all intents and purposes, any action, pretty much. I mean, there's been plenty of papers that have been written on the morality of good or bad in a nuclear launch scenario. And none of them, according to quote unquote any normative thesis about what is quote unquote prescriptive or culturally predefined, is going to say that any choice in a nuclear launch scenario is going to be objectively or normatively held as good.
Could I reply?
Hold on, Sammy, I'm about to complete. Which is why the Catholic Church is, at least because you're asking about from my Catholic position, that's why the Catholic Church, normatively speaking, does in fact quote unquote say, right, or hold that we need to do whatever we can to reduce nuclear armaments in the first place, because we already know that even in a nuclear launch scenario, that no outcome or no choice of outcome is ever going to be morally good. And so the best course of action, virtually speaking, is to try to not allow that circumstance to happen in the first place.
I see, but with respect to my question, the way it works in real life is we don't use Christianity. We use politics, like policies like quality of life taxes, how many children they have, how many dependents they have, how much charity they give, how many years they'll be alive to contribute to hospitals. None of this comes from religion. And when you're saying that religion is objective morality, then you need to be able to apply it to these scenarios. Otherwise, you're just saying, oh, we have it, but we're not going to use it. Because these scenarios is what we encounter in real life. And if religion is going to help, it needs to answer these questions. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you're not answering the question. That's the truth.
But that's not my premise. The thing is you're straw manning my position, right? By saying that we can't have, moral objectivity without religion. And I find that extremely idiosyncratic, because that's not my claim as a quote unquote religious person. I'm saying that the Bible or ecclesiastical authority is one among many sources by which we can derive moral facts about the world. And that is the heart. I don't want to turn this into a free will discussion, but it's pretty clear that there are more fundamental and innate determinative factors about how we were created in the first place, where it was not necessary for us to be created in the first place, that can influence or can give us the quote unquote structure of conditions to be able to observe the facts, epistemologically speaking, or even normatively speaking, in the first place. So
about that,
hold on. What I would say is I'm going to actually push back on you that quote unquote that religiously influenced normative quote unquote moral facts do not pertain to reality as it is. I'll give you the example of the border issue. How would you go about, without quote unquote religion, trying to address the issue of the border issue right now as we experience it in the American context?
I know, but I'm using your argument.
No. What do you mean? I asked you a particular question from your perspective, Sammy.
I'm going to answer that.
Without an appeal to some quote unquote, divine or revelatory source of moral facts. How do you approach the border crisis that we have? How are you going to establish the boundaries between cultures, not only cultures but also countries? How do you do that, Sammy?
I already answered that. I said politics, but whatever. Going back to
the aggregate of people's speech or the aggregate of people's behavior, Sammy.
Policies are in place.
It seems like you could equivocate between both. Is it the behaviors of the particular polity, or is it the speech of the polity, Sammy?
Could I answer? Sure. Basically, in these scenarios, we have, as I mentioned before, we have loads and loads of policies which are divorced from religion. Where like there's a MDT, a multidisciplinary team.
I don't think that you can maintain a divorce between the quote unquote natural.
Okay. I'm going to address that. I'm going to address that.
Those normative principles based on versus the actual normative.
Did you finish responding, Sammy?
Reject that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Did you finish responding, or did he interrupt you there?
He interrupted me like many times.
So Abysmo, let's calm down with the interruptions a little bit.
Abysmo, like. I know what you're trying to say, but me and four other people. It's not just me. Four other people, and one is, I think, like has like a prescription, whatever. We all got confused when you said to Bubba, "What about Christianity versus Hinduism?" So you do. You remember
the context in which I had said that?
You're trying to say that you kind of shot yourself in the foot in that scenario where he was talking about like morality is subjective. Then you say, what about Hinduism and Christianity?
No.
Then
It was about how whether we have more plausible reasons to ascribe to a divine theory for moral objectivity rather than from any other quote unquote moral theory. That was the question, and I was going to say, if I was to ascribe to a quote unquote divine command theory of normative quote unquote values, how would that be? How would that be more plausible than if I was a Hindu versus when I was an Indian or was a Muslim? Reasonably coexist with even an atheist, because and I have yet to hear from anyone's question, right? How, in the case of a moral objectivist, we can get from an is to an ought. I think that's the more interesting question that we could actually talk about. I think this is a great case that demonstrates, right, that if you're too fixated on issues about...
we don't need to go into that. You did answer the question, fine. It sounds like. And then Trez has a question for Bubba, I think.
Bro, that Sammy guy got cooked, by the way. Anyway, okay, Bubba. Okay. Bubba, is it okay to genocide people if it's socially acceptable?
Trez, what did I say in my opening?
If it's socially acceptable to genocide people and if it's just happening everywhere?
Yes, I answered this question. Let's see if you were listening.
Then can you just do it?
Trez, are you... I'm going to answer his question, but then I want to show some genuine concern. The answer is...
Thank you, Trez. Okay. So
we got a couple more hands up. I'm free. I'm open.
I can pull Ego up.
If your time allows, Taco, I'm cool.
I mean, if you want to talk to Ego again real fast, I can pull him back up. Let's just not overtalk him when he's asking questions.
Okay.
Ego again?
Well, yeah, that is kind of like... I appreciate it, brother, but that is kind of weird. There's other people waiting. I don't want to like somebody else has their hand.
I'm keeping everybody on stage over 18.
Oh, I see. Well, Bubba, how can we have this conversation where it's like somewhat interesting for you? Because you're dying on the side, bro. I see you.
So Ego, go ahead and ask one more question, and then I'll bring up Vinny, and then we'll go ahead and do the conclusion.
So Abysmo, I'm just gonna try and direct my questions at Bubba, just so I can get their interpretation, because I already like
that's fair.
Yours, and I have that. Very, very limited time, right? Like I don't have time basically to be thorough. So Bubba, my line of inquiry with like the queerness argument, you saw what I was trying to do, right? Like I was trying to provide an epistemic undercutter to this like notion of objectivity. Like how are you going to appeal to objectivity if we don't have like a way towards it? Would you say that's more or less correct, or how would you interpret that?
I would interpret that the way that we know whether or not something is good, bad, right, or wrong comes from your own subjective interpretation. And I said it was one of the first things I said when we started, which was just because I interpret something to be the case, that doesn't mean that it's objectively the case. If I determine murder to be bad, that does not mean that it's objectively bad. And so when it comes to the queerness argument, that's a very simple, probably boring response on how I would answer.
Right. Okay. This creates another can of wormholes about like democracy being a tyranny of the majority, though.
Yeah. And for like, if we were to democratically vote and determine whether or not I need to stop using that word. What's a good replacement word? Unaliving people. To say that.
Unaliving.
Yeah. If we were to democratically come together and say that it is okay for me to unalive random homeless people in the street, then that does not mean that it's objectively true. It just means that all it simply shows is that the majority of people determine it to be true.
Okay. And I'm just curious, like for the sake of just getting an intuitive understanding, like what's your moral views, or like how do you go about it? Are you like a utilitarian, or like what?
Well, getting into like, I don't have one way to just interpret my moral framework in a way that would be quick and easy that I could do in just a few sentences. It'd be like,
sure, of course.
I believe what is moral comes from generally what I believe to be good. Like I believe what Jesus said, do unto others what you would have done to you. I think when it comes to sexual morality, I think that consent is the number one thing. When it comes to like killing people, I think that when it comes to unaliving people, I'm so used to that word. When it comes to unaliving people, then it comes down to whether another person was trying to unalive you. It's a bunch of it's like a bunch of little things. It's hard to I can't put it into one word.
But like, I'm just gonna share some intuitions of mine, right? I'm personally a vegan, and I care about climate change. And if somebody, for example, doesn't consider like animals worthy of moral consideration, then I'm gonna try to have motivating reasons. But then at the end of the day, if they just literally don't care about like empathy, then that's like a dead end road. I can only really appeal to climate change. Do you get what I mean? So there seems to be an element of reason in morality, right? But I don't think their reason is like a universal component. Reason is just another interpretation. Would you say that's more or less correct?
Yeah. And when it comes to veganism, I wouldn't even say that climate change is the number one reason as to why people eat animals. It's a bunch of other very generalized reasons. Like you could say that to us, they are not as from a utilitarian perspective, useful to the world outside of being meat in which we can eat. Like a cow's pretty dumb, we're pretty smart, we can provide more for what we.
Is this your view?
Is this off the top of my head a reason as to why you could argue against veganism?
Sure.
I was like
the vegan debate. I'm pretty good at that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Fine. Yeah. I don't want to get smoked in the vegan debate. That would be embarrassing.
Yeah. But like.
Yeah.
All right. Last
Could
portion.
I respond to this? Ego. I mean, I think this is a very interesting line of questioning. Do you mind if I chime in?
No.
Okay.
Taco, I'm gonna defer my judgment to you.
I'm cool with
20 seconds, and then let's go ahead and move on to the next guest.
Okay.
But who gets the speaking time now, Taco?
Abysmo can respond for 20 seconds, I guess, and then Bubba, since he wants to jump in.
All right, okay. I mean, so I already had prepared, right? Like, like going through Schaefer-Landau's, I guess like responses to Occam's razors in this case. I like the vegan argument of line of interpretation. I think it's important to distinct, where veganism applies and where it might not apply, okay? So according to Occam's razor, right, it states that one should at least amount to an ontological, should appeal to the least amount of ontological entities in an explanation, right? It's basically it just to believe in the simplest amount of explanation or simplest explanation, given any sort of different facts. Do we need to appeal to objective moral facts in order to explain things we observe? The example, right, that's given by Schaefer-Landau is that like an example of a bird falling from a tree, right? We could say that based on our observations that maybe he's maybe this particular person is and decides to help the bird. Maybe it's because according to some objective moral law, or maybe some feeling, or about our own thoughts about what his moral laws are, right? And his first response goes like this, okay? If we use Occam's razor, then we have to get rid of all the more ontological entities than just the tree itself or the bird itself, and we would have to try to do a reductio ad absurdum down to like level of quanta, right? This we can go back and forth in debating about this, especially when it comes to
that's sufficient, Abysmo. So we'll go ahead.
No, I don't think it's sufficient. No, Taco, I don't think it is all. I think this is a very valid point about veganism. That's what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I agree, but like unfortunately, we just do not have the economical resources in terms of time to like go through this. I'm sorry.
Okay, sure, that's fine. That's fine. All right, we could do like an after party later.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Bubba wanted to jump in as well. It sounded like.
No, it's fine.
Oh no. Okay, cool.
Okay, I'm gonna leave, but we'll have to debate some other time. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thank you. And then we'll go ahead and pull up the last person, Vinny. I did invite you up. Cool. Hey, Vinny.
Hello, all. How's everyone doing tonight?
Oh, good.
What's going on, Vinny?
Been better.
It is what it is.
It's good to see you, man. Yo, Bubba, if you don't mind if I just kind of hop into it. So you're arguing for subjective morality, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I would be inclined to agree with you on certain things. I myself, I am a new Christian, but before that I was a subjective moralist, and I debated it with people quite a bit. So I have an understanding of it. But, everyone kind of approaches it differently. For me, like subjective morality just boils down to what's good for you is what you're going to ascribe as good. Like if it's good for you to say, like boiling it down to what happened back in the day, like if it's good for our country to engage in imperialism or conquer this other country, this other tribe, that's good for our people, so we should do it, because it is good. But it's not good for the people being conquered, right? So how do you balance, what the subjective good, the subjective bad with governing and leading a society?
I can answer that in two parts. When it comes to imperialism, anger. I think Aquinas said this, unless I'm mistaken. It's that anger is
Okay.
justified if it is used in the right level to the right target, for the right reason. So, if imperialism, if you're going to actually conquer for a person just for the sake of conquering, I would see, and most people would see that as unjust. But if you're actually conquering for the reason of maybe the other tribe wronged you for whatever reason, then it could be justified to kind of take over their lands and law over the nation. And when it comes to determining, and your second question was something along the lines of like determining whether or not something is just or unjust.
No, not exactly. And if I could just like kind of, I wouldn't say respond to it, but just add this into it. Justified, just or unjust. What metric are you using to determine that?
My own rationality.
Just your own rationality.
Yes.
And most people generally agree, like, hey, killing people is bad if you don't have to do it.
Yes.
Most people believe that. However, whenever it comes to like human society, I'm sure, as you know, is very complicated. Like you have gang members wearing like Christian crosses and whatnot, going to church. People are a bit crazy with it. And the thing with subjective morality is ultimately like just or unjust really doesn't matter. It only matters insofar as enough people believe in said thing to be just, therefore it is actionable and applied in society through use of force. If you engage in unjust behavior, armed men will take you and throw you in a place that you can't leave. And that is ultimately what makes people conform to these standards. So, but the head hasn't always been consistent on what we found just or unjust. Imperialism and conquest, and as you put it, conquest for conquest's sake. I would rather say conquest for the sake of, men, money, materials. Just conquering things is profitable. So, is it not good for a society to be conquering others if they're able to manage the new resource intake effectively? I would say that yes, it is good for them to do it. Not so good for the people conquered. Debatable in certain circumstances, but in general, no one wants to be conquered.
Yeah, and it's very contextual. Like if conquered implies coming in forcibly and killing all the leaders in order to prescribe new leaders into the nation, this is all very contextual. And if it means like having to kill a number of innocent people in the process, again, it's very contextual. I think it's very unlikely that a nation would just willingly give up their lands to another nation. It's very rare in history that happens. And something that you said that I found interesting, which I'm not sure is part of your questioning, you can feel free to stop me.
No, go ahead.
It's when you said that when a nation gets taken over by a bigger, stronger nation, and then all their laws are prescribed now to that nation. They must follow their laws and follow their morale, right? That is completely consistent with my worldview. It's that like you are conditioned to believe the things that you consider to be good, bad, right, and wrong. So if you, over a long, tedious process, end up believing at one point that, I'm trying to think of an example, is that
Nazi Germany. You would have to be committed that Nazi Germany was okay morally.
There's the drunk.
Morally speaking, relatively to their culture. That's the thing, Bubba. That's what moral relativism is.
Abysmo, this is time for Bubba and Vinny, because Vinny wanted to ask him a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Bubba. So you're talking about like the use case for conditioning people after conquest, South America, and found the Aztecs and they're doing human sacrifice, and the Spanish were like, whoa, let's not do that anymore. Ultimately, I think that is a good thing that they were conditioned.
Yeah, it can more or less. And the thing is, you might find it to be good, but someone else might find it to be bad. And that's the whole idea of why I believe subjective morality is more consistent with reality.
I completely agree with you on that. When it comes to reality and it comes to the worldly things, I don't even think, like as a Christian, you're compelled to disagree with that. I think that you would be compelled to disagree with the idea that subjective morality should be applied universally, and you should ascribe to it. But remember, like according to the Christian theology, this world is a fallen world, and its laws are not the laws of God, right? So the laws of the world, and subjective morality is the law of the world. Let's be completely real. Like this material space, it is governed by subjective morality. Like every single war, like even the ones that were written as like moral wars, the Crusades, bro. Most of the people who engaged in the Crusades, the people who kicked them off, it was for pure power. Like the Pope was trying to preserve his political base and preserve his power and expand his influence. And the kings and all that, like it was for money. And whenever you didn't pay the Crusaders, they sacked their own holy city. So, most wars in history are just about money, material, and people, and land, of course, from which to get more money, material, and people. Completely accurate. I don't know what to disagree with there.
What? There's. I don't think there's much.
Maybe you could help us.
No, I definitely agree. Right. The central problem is how do you get from an is to an ought, and that's a normative claim, right? That's why we should be suspicious of quote unquote like divine command theories, right? How are we to know that just because someone speaks in the name of the church or even God, that their word is true, if there wasn't some external principle of morality to begin with? And I fundamentally believe that given the conditions, right, we not only have psychological reasons, right, but we also have virtuous reasons, quote unquote, to appeal to as quote unquote objective facts about human nature that we can appeal to in determining normative norms. Can popes, can crusaders be objectively wrong on the facts? Yes, they can.
Yeah, I mean, from an objective standpoint, the Catholic Church is wrong. It's completely incorrect. And the Crusaders, as they were doing the bidding of the Catholic Church, first of all, we are not compelled to evangelize by sword point. We're not compelled to fourth conversion. We are told to do otherwise, actually. So the Catholic way
it's debatable what the quote unquote purpose of the Crusades was, right? Like, and scholars, debate this all the time. Was it more for political purposes or was it for theological purposes? I don't think you're going to find any serious quote unquote, historian that's going to say that, oh no, it was always for theological purposes and therefore the church is at fault. No, it's a much more complex quote unquote circumstance than that, right? It's pretty clear and common sense that the reason why a pope at any given particular time could have advocated for quote unquote universal crusade in order to try to keep Europeans, the European countries, from warring with themselves. Like that argument is probably the most prevailing opinion, right?
Right.
The theological question about whether that was right or wrong according to God, that's debatable among like theological propositions and not moral propositions. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think that what Bubba's saying is that whenever you apply subjective morality to the lens of how people conduct themselves and what decisions people and polities make, it's the most consistent way to do it. Like, people have their own motivations for doing things. Just to make this very simple, they have their own motivations for doing things, and these motivations, 9 times out of 10, end up with them benefiting. Like their people may benefit, their polity may benefit, but at the end of the day, they want to benefit too. Like they're not
but in that case, what you're actually presupposing is that there's some external factor,
Last point
whether
here.
it's a utilitarian or a deontological one. You see what I mean? And that's basically my point. That ultimately, I believe Bubba thinks he's a quote unquote subjective moralist, but he's actually an objective one. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, Vinny, last point here.
Interesting, because Bubba was talking about like just and unjust reasons, and that's why I wanted to ask like reasons for clarification, because just and unjust is extremely subjective, especially if you don't ascribe to a higher deity. Like for you and I, just or unjust, we have a very simple way of determining that.
Right.
But
I'm with Noam Chomsky on this.
You cannot objectively determine that. It's impossible.
Yeah, I don't think
Okay, is there
questions
anything
about
else, Vinny,
justice or even power are as frivolous as regime change. So I'm with Noam Chomsky on this, even though I don't agree with a lot of his conclusions.
I don't think Bubba was saying that it's like simple.
Okay. So was there any other question, or
jump in here and kind of explain?
I would love for this to be the last question because I've been on
Yep.
debate stage for 2.5 hours, and I want conclusions, and I want to.
Yep, we're getting there.
I'm ready for more. I don't know why.
I'm not.
You know,
I- I'm not. I have to be.
got here like 30 minutes
Yeah.
ago. I'm fresh. It's all
Yeah,
good.
Okay.
yeah.
I understand. I understand. You gotta like.
Well, thank you,
Okay, so
thank
yeah,
you,
let's go
Vinny.
ahead and wrap this up for you. Do you have a, let's start with like your conclusion if you'd like.
Are you the mod?
Okay.
Are you the mod?
Nice, Vinny. Okay, so we're moving into the conclusions here. The affirmative is going to go first, and the negative is going to close it out. Bear with me for 2 seconds to get my timer.
oh, we're not taking any more stage questions.
No, that was the last one.
Okay. All
I
right.
have to. Yeah, I have to be at work at 6 a.m. It's 8:30. I need to get to bed.
No worries.
Yeah, so we're going to have the affirmative go first. So, Bubba, you can start whenever you're ready, and I'll start the timer.
Yeah, sure. I don't think I'm
Start
gonna
now?
take up 5. Yep, I don't think I'm gonna take up 5 minutes. Honestly, and this is my unfiltered opinion, is that I think that Abysmo's behavior and his answers to my questions were not representative of Catholicism, of believers of the Bible, of Christianity, of an objective moralist at all. He tried to infer that morality can be both objective and subjective at the same time, because there are objective truths, but you can take your own interpretation for them to be how you could take your interpretation for however you believe them to be, whatever level of true you prescribe them to be. And he couldn't answer my questions. He 100% filled up my time with garbage, like just constantly trying to interrupt my questions, inferring that I was inferring certain things. And he assumes that morality is he assumes that my belief on morality is what I believe is to be normative. He doesn't understand, which shows that he doesn't understand what I'm saying. I believe that morality is determined by the way that you were conditioned, and the way that you were conditioned is determined by the time and place that you were born into. And it's like, with that, I can see the rest, like probably the 3.5 full minutes of my time with a 5-minute conclusion. And I think that
Okay, thank you, Bubba. Abysmo, let me know when you're ready, and I'll start your timer.
Oh, I am ready.
What's up?
From the outset, I have had 2 criticisms of what I believe Bubba's view on subjective or moral subjectivism is. The first criticism is one from analogy. 1. Just because different cultures have different views on the shape of the Earth doesn't entail that science is subjective, and that there isn't a real shape of the Earth which we can observe. The same could be maintained for moral facts, namely that just because different cultures have different perspectives on morality doesn't entail that morality is subjective, and that there aren't morally real concepts or values which we can discover. The second criticism is that cultural differences on morality are not typically real moral differences themselves, but rather factual differences. For example, in some Muslim sects, it is okay to hold women as slaves because they are not considered to be believed to have souls. Say that the beliefs that people are conditioned to about the facts and not morality itself is what causes cultures to think what ought to be done in any given circumstance or even situation. The fact that humans across cultures disagree merely demonstrates that humans have not yet perfected the understanding of reality in pursuit of the truth. If Bubba believes that all humans are in error and not just cultures, when humans or cultures believe that moral duties, facts, and virtues exist, then why could it not be the case that many humans or cultures can simply be in error in understanding what is objectively true? In other words, couldn't it just be the case that the error is that some people are incorrect in understanding what is morally objective? Mere differences in culture is not evidence that moral facts, duties, and virtues do not exist, especially if one holds that humans can be in error when it comes to ethics in general from the outset. My position would claim that things like love and happiness are intrinsically good, and things like irrationality, disability, and pain are intrinsically bad. We have strong reasons to respond to love and happiness in some positive ways, whereas things like irrationality, disability, and pain are intrinsically bad, and we have strong reasons to respond to these in some negative ways. We appeal to normative concepts in order to form normative claims and statements that, if true, would be true in an objective sense. This is to say that some claim is objectively true if its truth does depend on the attitudes or response of any particular subject. However, there are those who dissent from these common sense perspectives and claim that nothing is intrinsically good or bad. Normative anti-realism, the opposing position, would claim that nothing in the world is intrinsically good or intrinsically bad in the sense that we do not have any reasons to care about anything for its own sake. In other words, normative anti-realists claim that nothing really matters because they deny that there are any objective normative truths. If this were true, then we would have no reason to respond to anything either positively or negatively. Because again, nothing really matters. This implies that all our normative judgments would be mistaken, or not just mistaken, but pure nonsense. Bubba begins by arguing from intuition regarding the concept of moral reason, but then rejects realism even though it functions in the same way. The arguments against realism don't actually demonstrate that moral facts and duties can't exist or even do not likely exist. Instead, he assumes their conclusion and ironically ignores the possibility that different humans or cultures could just be in error, all the while stating that humans are in error. Could it just be that there are so many problems with moral subjectivism that Bubba's account seems nothing more than a huge error? A moral relativist would have to concede that Dr. Martin Luther King was not a moral agent. Clearly, it is a fact that racial segregation is related to institutional slavery, but this does not make the issues of racial segregation relative to any subjective point of view. Rather, Dr. Martin Luther King made the claim that racial segregation was not in continuity, but rather a disintegration of the abolition of slavery itself. In another example, Henry David Thoreau, in his advocacy for civil disobedience, he says he himself refused to pay taxes because he did not support paying taxes to a country which would support racial segregation. Rosa Parks, it was objectively moral for her not to obey segregation laws merely because of the color of her skin. I argue that in at least the American tradition, one cannot maintain that morality is merely subjective without excluding the real moral discoveries, which even in the American cultural context of constitutionality. So clearly, objective moral facts not only transcend the cultural context, but history itself. Catholicism claims universality, but my moral intuition informs me to seek out whether or not this claim is true, and this moral motivation, which I claim as a Catholic, does definitively confirm in a non-self-referential way that Catholicism is true.
Closing. Perfect.
The theist can hold that even an atheist can come to know moral facts and duties only for the theist. The theist is not confined to merely the intuitive access to these moral facts and duties, and that rather
he's not going to shut up, Taco.
All right. So time was called like 20 seconds ago. So that
he will go on. Yeah, he will go on all day if we don't stop him.
Calm down. That time was called about 20 seconds ago. So that was a good debate. I really appreciate everybody being here on both sides in the audience and on stage. I'm sorry to interrupt you there. Just time was up there, right? For a little bit, I let you go on, right? But with that being said, I really appreciate everybody being here in both audiences and on stage. You're all awesome. Make sure if you're in YouTube to join https://www.discord.gg/politics, where we host these debates. And if you're in the audience here or on YouTube, follow both of these guys, or if you like them, whatever, feel free to follow them. All their stuff is linked in the chat on both YouTube and in Discord.
Thank you, Taco.
Where do you guys want to have the after conversation?
I don't want to go to Ask the Catholics room because that's going to be terrible.
You can do that in religion chat.
Religion chat? I can go in religion chat.
Just a general religion chat. That's just a server room, right? So it sounds like it'll be in religion chat then. And once again, I really appreciate everyone being here. We've got some more great debates coming up over the next week. We've got Jim Bob versus T-Jump on Saturday. And then on Thursday, we're going to have that one should be pretty crazy fun. But there's also going to be the guy who does roundhouse kicks, Minar, versus
Minar
versus Grayson. So that's going to be a ton of fun. Minar. That's on Thursday evening. So that one is going to be a lot of fun too. Both those debates should be great. And then I've got some more in the works that I'm working on still. So there's a lot of stuff coming up. But I really appreciate everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close this out now. Everybody that wants to chat and ask additional questions, just filter into the religion chat. And everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.